Hey everyone, welcome back. Chapters 861 through 870 of the previous episode. Chen Ping'an executes an evil city god and bravely withstands a heavenly tribulation to save mortals. Though severely wounded, he rescues an infant and kills a scheming assassin, drawing the greedy gaze of elite immortals. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 871. Please feel free to take the sword, everyone. Amid the sea of clouds, Xiaozhen no longer maintained his form as a streak of light to soar on the wind. Instead, he clasped his hands behind his back and walked forward slowly. There was an exasperated expression on Xiaozhen's face as he muttered to himself, "Since this person is from the Flax Robe sect, I guess I shouldn't go and provoke him?" He glanced back at the capital of the blissful dream nation. That old man had obtained the innate sword pellet, and now a pseudo-celestial tool had coincidentally appeared in the Silver Screen Nation as well. These were destined fated opportunities for the old man. So would he truly be able to resist the strong temptation? How could he succeed as a vagrant cultivator with such a cowardly personality? He had truly managed to cultivate his mind and his character after pretending to be a mortal human in the blissful dream nation for several dozen years. Xiaozhen extended a hand and said several names, coincidentally enough to count on 5 fingers. Any more than this, and he would be delaying his pursuit of the great Tao. There was Fan Weiran, who was easy to order around, Yihan, who was fairly smart, He Lu, who possessed good aptitude, Yanqing, who also possessed good aptitude, and Little Cui, who was slightly eccentric. Xiaozhen raised his other hand and said another 5 names, names belonging to young individuals who didn't yet possess high cultivation bases. Xiaozhen leisurely strolled along the sea of clouds, looking at his 2 palms and lightly clenching them into fists as he murmured, "Can 10 golden core tier cultivators compare to me advancing to the unpolished jade tier? Should I kill them all?" However, he quickly shook his head and answered his own question, saying, "Forget about it, there's no hurry at all. I'll leave 5 positions open for them to become golden core tier cultivators, and I'll kill whoever has a chance to advance to the nascent tier. This should free up the 5 other positions." Xiaozhen placed his hands on his azure belt and continued, "That old man is truly quite impressive. I didn't understand why he insisted on having me suppress the martial fortune of the dozen or so nations in our sworn oath back then, not allowing any Vajrabadi tier martial artists to appear. As it turns out, this was in order to reduce the amount of military conflict between the dozen or so nations, giving him, the elusive prime minister and imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation, an opportunity to peacefully obtain virtue without getting blood and bad karma on his hands." Xiaozhen stretched lazily. He involuntarily recalled the scene of the heavenly tribulation. This caused him to immediately feel solemn again. Perhaps he was one of the 10 young prodigies in the continent, similar to Lu Jinglong and Yang Ningxing? But this didn't appear to be the case, and after careful analysis, he didn't match any of the 10 young prodigies. Xiaozhen stopped in his tracks and looked around, asking with a faint smile, "Which fellow cultivator is this? Why don't you dare to show yourself?" On the other end of the sea of clouds, at the limit of his vision, there was a person standing there unmoving. However, the clouds beneath the person's feet suddenly churned like waves, rising up and surging towards Xiaozhen. Xiaozhen was unfazed, not retreating a single step as he gently patted the azure snake, which was already transforming into a flood dragon, by his waist. He smiled faintly in his mind and murmured, "There's no need to worry. Engaging in close-quarter combat suits me perfectly." The uninvited visitor appeared travel-worn and exhausted, and he gracefully hovered down after the wave-like sea of clouds seemingly crashed onto the shore. He slowly walked forward, and he was like a talkative old friend as he relentlessly grumbled, "You people are truly troublesome and don't give me any time to rest, forcing me to travel back here from the sea of clouds. Do you think I can be summoned back and forth like an intercontinental ship? So be it if this were all, but I was almost hacked to death by the embarrassed and angry little Quaner as well. Fortunately, there was a slight sense of tacit understanding between my brother and me, or else I would have genuinely failed to notice the situation over here. Even so, I've still arrived late. I've arrived too late. Regardless, my brother shouldn't have taken revenge on the woman who was so attracted to him like that. So be it. If he didn't act like this, then he wouldn't be the brother whom I sincerely admire from the bottom of my heart. In any case, that woman's feelings are indeed impossible to accept and appreciate. Her feelings are far too overwhelming, so my brother can't be blamed for his reaction. The uninvited visitor continued to mumble in dissatisfaction, saying, "Does the feng shui of the northern complete reed continent have something against me or what? Can't it allow me to peacefully return home to meander around and wait for death? I was always kind to other people when I lived here before, and I had a glowing reputation both in the mountains and outside the mountains. I was like a perfect son-in-law in the northern complete reed continent back then, so I shouldn't be toyed around with and treated so badly now." His tongue was unrestrained as he uttered absolute nonsense. Xiaozhen was extremely baffled by this person's words, but he didn't pay too much heed to them. After all, would a cultivator who had obtained Tao reveal any clues through their words? Moreover, this person was speaking fluently in the official dialect of the northern complete reed continent, yet he was trying to claim that he was an outsider traveling through the continents? The person in front of him was an unfamiliar face, and he was definitely using his true appearance and not using any illusion technique. Unless this person was an immortal tier cultivator from the pinnacle of the mountains, any illusion technique would be ineffective against Xiaozhen, even if it were an unpolished jade tier illusion technique. The sea of clouds beneath the person's feet gradually dissipated. His cultivation base wasn't low, but he seemingly liked to show off using these kinds of measly techniques. Not only did Xiaozhen not retreat, but he even slowly advanced a few steps, asking with a smile, "Dare I ask for fellow cultivator's name?" The person hesitated for a moment before retreating 2 steps and replying, "My nickname is Zhou Fei, and my actual name is..." "Forget about it. I'm afraid that you have women at home or in your immortal force." What absolute nonsense was this? However, Xiaozhen remained calm and composed as he asked, "May I ask, for what reason has fellow cultivator blocked my path?" Zhou Fei was indeed a handsome person, appearing refined and elegant as he stood above the sea of clouds. "Just pretend that I'm begging you, okay?" Zhou Fei said with an aggrieved expression. "Can you mighty cultivators calm down for a bit? Can you allow me to peacefully return to the eastern treasured vile continent?" Xiaozhen sighed and replied with an apologetic expression, "I won't entertain fellow cultivator any longer if fellow cultivator is going to continue speaking in riddles and continue to spout incomprehensible nonsense." Zhou Fei, who was clearly using a pseudonym, faltered upon hearing this, and he responded, "I'm speaking so directly already, yet you still don't understand me? Good heavens! I'm not trying to scold you or anything, but would you and the others have been worthy enough to scheme against my brother if it weren't for your nascent tier cultivation bases?" Xiaozhen finally understood the situation. This person was here to avenge that young sword immortal? Xiaozhen looked around and clicked his tongue in wonder, asking, "You're by yourself, right? Have you ever heard this saying before? I, Xiaozhen, can kill nascent tier cultivators within 30 meters. The man called Zhou Fei put his feet together and directly jumped to within 15 meters of Xiaozhen, seemingly seeking death as he chuckled. "All right. Now let me Zhang Shangzhen help you grow some smarts." Xiaozhen almost suffered a mental breakdown on the spot. Cultivators in the northern complete reed continent had always been haughty and arrogant, and sword cultivator from the continent were especially renowned for their supercilious nature. They felt like everyone apart from those hailing from the Middle-earth divine continent was trash, with their cultivation bases being trash, their immortal treasures being trash, and their backgrounds being trash. These people were completely worthless and not worth a mention. However, there were a few exceptional cases from the other continents, and these were peculiar individuals whom the northern complete reed continent couldn't forget no matter what. In fact, cultivators in the northern complete reed continent would continue to pay attention to these peculiar individuals even after they returned to their home continents. For example, there was the cultivator whom a great sword immortal from the central region and a great sword immortal from the northern region had both proclaimed that they would personally kill. The parasol leaf continent's Zhang Shangzhen. Inside the Dragon Palace at the bottom of Verdant Bamboo Lake, there was another grand gathering. Lake Lord Inho didn't sit on the steps leading to the dragon throne this time, and he instead stood between the two immortal forces as he said, "I received a messenger flying sword just then, and that person is traveling toward Verdant Bamboo Lake on his sword." Apart from Fan Weiran smiling coldly, Yi Han remaining unfazed, and the golden boy and the jade girl appearing slightly astonished. The remaining cultivators on both sides were deeply shocked and immediately erupted into frenzy. There was a dark expression on Lake Lord Inho's face as he said, "Yi Han, great city Lord Yi. Who was it that said the outsider sword immortal was severely wounded and could be slowly ground to death by us not long ago? We've only just started to put together a plan, yet he's already charged over to my base at Verdant Bamboo Lake. So what should we do now? Are your immortal forces going to flee in various directions and be picked off one by one? Or are you all going to stay here and massage your knees, making it easier to kneel and kowtow in a moment?" He Lu was calm and unfazed, holding the bamboo flute in his hand as he stood up and said, "One formation has been set up outside Imperial Accompanying City, and the other formation has been set up right here at Verdant Bamboo Lake. Add to that the mountain and water formation of Lake Lord's Dragon Palace, and I feel like we can leave the doors wide open and allow him to freely enter the formations. Afterward, our three forces can combine our power. With City Lord Yi, Old Ancestor Fan, the two formations and 100 or so cultivators here, we can definitely rival that immortal's power, right? On the other hand, we would have needed to continue sacrificing bait if he had holed up in Imperial Accompanying City and refused to venture out. That would have soured the relationship between us and resulted in increasing dissatisfaction. That being the case, is it not a good thing for him to voluntarily head over?" Lake Lord Inho was infuriated and he roared, "That's easy for you to say, young immortal he. It's taken me 1,000 years to build up Verdant Bamboo Lake. Yet your two immortal forces will at most lose a formation and a small amount of immortal coins. A huge battle might erupt afterward, blotting out heaven and earth and leaving corpses strewn across the floor, with my dragon palace potentially collapsing as a result. When we finally obtain a Pyrrhic victory and kill that detestable criminal, I would have sacrificed my dragon palace for nothing if we share the spoils according to the previous agreements. Won't I cry to death at that time?" There was a dazzling smile on He Lu's face as he replied, "Our previous agreement assigned 20% of the spoils to Verdant Bamboo Lake, 40% to the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, and 40% to Yellow Axe City. Now, Yellow Axe City is willing to take 10% less and give this to Lake Lord as a form of compensation. Apart from this, we'll stick to the initial agreement. If one party is determined to obtain a certain treasure, then all three parties will come together to prescribe a fair and agreed value to the treasure first, converting this value into snowflake coins or lesser heat coins. After that, we'll include a small premium on the treasure as a form of gratitude to the two other parties for giving it up." After saying this, He Lu looked to the opposite side of the palace, with his gaze sweeping over the young woman whom he coveted before settling on Old Ancestor Fan Weiran. "Old Ancestor Fan?" he asked with a smile. The old woman had seemingly been tired and nodding off just then, but she smiled upon hearing this and responded, "That's acceptable. The Treasure Basin Immortal Realm is also willing to give 10% of the spoils to Lake Lord Inho, as a form of gratitude, to Verdant Bamboo Lake's Dragon Palace." Lake Lord Inho looked toward Yi Han, with the latter nodding lightly in response. Only after seeing this did Lake Lord Inho feel satisfied. He Lu didn't say anything else. Everyone in the Dragon Palace looked at the handsome and refined young man, with their minds swaying slightly as they developed utmost respect for him. If it weren't for the fact that He Lu wasn't City Lord Yi Han's son, and the fact that Yellow Axe City had never passed the position of City Lord to an outsider, how could Yi Han's two good-for-nothing sons possibly compete with He Lu? There was a dazzling jewel curtain over at the side entrance of the palace, and a beautiful woman gently lifted one corner of the curtain and looked at the handsome and witty young man with tender affection in her eyes. There was actually such an outstanding young man in the world. All of the decent-looking impoverished scholars and wealthy disciples that she had encountered in the past were far inferior to Yellow Axe City's Mr. He. In fact, even the sum of them was inferior to him. He was like a handsome and otherworldly immortal who had walked out from the unofficial history books and the literary works of scholars. Inside the ghost residence at Imperial Accompanying City, Yu felt completely helpless as he carried the swaddled and sleeping child in his arms. He suddenly turned around, only to see a tall and handsome man jumping over the wall and entering the courtyard, after which he pushed his chi to his dantian. Yu immediately stood up, feeling as if he were facing a formidable foe. When he glanced at the vermilion wine gourd on the bamboo chair, however, he was surprised to see that no flying sword flew out. Du felt a slight sense of despair. He tightly gripped the walnut that the mighty senior had given him before departing. The uninvited visitor raised his hands and chuckled. Calm down, calm down. My name is Zhou Fei and I'm Chen Haoran. This is the name that he's using now, right? In any case, I'm a sworn brother of his, and we're like-minded people. I noticed the huge commotion here, and even though my cultivation base isn't high, I'm obliged to help now that my brother is facing danger. I hurriedly made my way over here to check on the situation and see whether there was anything that I could assist with. Fortunately, this place was quite easy to find. Anyway, where is Brother Haoran? And who are you? You didn't trust this person at all. Zhou Fei pointed at the wine gourd on the bamboo chair and said, There are 2 flying swords in the wine gourd, and one has left and one has stayed behind to protect you. That being the case, will it not fly out to protect you if it doesn't recognize me? Du trusted this person a tiny bit more. Zhou Fei glanced at Du's hand and continued, Oh yes, that walnut is unparalleled in the world and equivalent to the full power strike of an earth immortal, correct? It's indeed very suitable against bad people, but please don't use it to scare your own brothers. My physique is even frilier than my confidence, so please don't kill me by accident with that walnut. Anyhow, what's your name? You look proper and mighty, and it's clear that you're a paramount elite. It's no wonder that my brother is comfortable with asking you to look after this residence. I haven't seen my brother for a few days, and he's already gone ahead and had a child. How outrageously impressive. Comparing oneself to other people is truly quite infuriating. Du's expression felt slightly stiff. Why the hell did this person's garbage nonsense carry a unique charm? He genuinely appeared a bit like the mighty senior's Dao friend? Zhou Fei jogged over to Du, causing the latter to tense up and have a huge battle in his mind. However, Du didn't do anything extra apart from tightly gripping the walnut in his hand. Zhou Fei was quite tactful as well, simply grabbing Du's small stool and placing it slightly further away before sitting down. Du cautiously sat down on the bamboo chair and replied in a solemn voice, My name is Du, and I'm a cultivator from the Ghost Axe Palace. Senior has asked me to temporarily look after this child. The person called Zhou Fei raised a thumb and said with a look of admiration, I've been a long-time admirer of the widely renowned Ghost Axe Palace. Are you truly Senior's friend? Du asked. 100% as true as they come, Zhou Fei replied with a smile. Du didn't dare to fully trust Zhou Fei's words. Zhou Fei smiled and asked, Does this brother of mine like to speak reason and speak principle? Moreover, you definitely didn't take his reasons and principles seriously to begin with, feeling like they were mysterious and baffling. Am I correct? Du relaxed and slumped down, feeling as if a huge weight had been taken off his shoulders. Have you truly heard of the Ghost Axe Palace before? Du asked in puzzlement. Zhou Fei nodded and replied, Didn't you self-introduce it to me just then? Is it not normal for me to hurriedly express admiration toward a force that has a powerful cultivator such as yourself? Du smiled bitterly and said, Since you're a friend of Senior, you're definitely an extremely powerful cultivator as well, so please don't tease me like this. I'm certainly no powerful cultivator. However, Zhou Fei replied, Even someone like you can't be regarded as a powerful cultivator? Do you know that your so-called senior, my brother Haoran, seldom ever trusts other people? Perhaps we can get rid of the word other. In fact, he doesn't even trust himself. So, I'm truly very curious about what you did and what you said to impress Brother Haoran. Du shook his head and replied, I only did some minor things, but Senior's piercing gaze is able to see far into the distance and far into the future, so Senior most likely saw something that even I was unable to see. Zhou Fei faltered for a long time, rendered slightly speechless. In the end, he could only exclaim, Fucking hell! Are you my arch-enemy in the battle of the Great Tao? However, he quickly shook his head and continued, So be it. I'll just treat you as a like-minded junior first. After saying this, Zhou Fei stood up angrily, somehow appearing in front of Du straight away. He stood there and lightly pulled back a corner of the blankets, after which he calculated something on his fingers. He nodded and murmured to himself, There is some minor karmic fate, so taking this away will be fine. This will also save him some small but unnecessary troubles. After all, does it make sense for a wanderer to travel around the cultivation world with an orphan? How will he attract the fancy of celestial maidens? Things have already come to this, so this is the most that I can do. This child has a tiny bit of cultivation aptitude, and nothing is scarier than having too much money. Little child, you probably accumulated a lot of virtue in your past life to come across Brother Howren and then me. The weight suddenly disappeared from Du Yu's arms as the swaddled child was taken away by Zhou Fei. Du Yu immediately shuddered, and he was instinctively about to fight to the death with this person. His life, death, and riches, as well as the safety of his parents and his immortal force, were all dependent on the events in this small courtyard. Zhou Fei smiled and said, "There's no need to worry. You can tell my brother afterward that the little child was taken by Zhou Fei and brought to the eastern treasured Vile continent to be settled down. He can continue to travel around the cultivation world in peace. Nothing will go wrong." The rims of Du Yu's eyes were bright red, and he was just about to reach over to snatch the child back. How could he give away the child just like this? Zhou Fei extended a finger and froze Du Yu to the spot, after which he winked and asked, "I've heard of the Ghost Axe Palace now, so have you heard of Jiang Shangzhen before?" Jiang as in ginger, Shang as in revere, and Zhen as in real. Du Yu was almost led astray by Zhou Fei's words, causing him to feel both terrified and furious. However, he suddenly came to his senses and roared, "I'm your bloody grandfather, Jiang Shangzhen. Give me the child back." Zhou Fei extended a hand and lightly adjusted the blankets, lest the little child be woken up by Du Yu's shouting. He then raised a thumb and remarked, "How bold and impressive. You're even more capable than Xiaozhan, someone who can fight and flee and possesses half of the demeanor that I had in the past. Sure enough, my brother was astute and correct to have you look after this residence." Du Yu had genuinely never heard of Jiang Shangzhen before. However, Jiang Shangzhen immediately broadened Du Yu's horizon in the next moment, flicking his wrist and retrieving a golden militarian armor pellet before lightly tossing it to Du Yu. The armor pellet landed on top of the immobilized Du Yu's head, and Jiang Shangzhen said, "Since you're a paramount militarian cultivator, let me gift you this golden crow armor that's befitting of someone as powerful as you." Du Yu was dumbstruck, and Jiang Shangzhen looked at him with pity and asked, "The Ghost Axe Palace definitely doesn't have any beautiful celestial maidens, am I right?" Du Yu's mind was completely blank at this moment. Afterward, the uninvited guest vanished just like that. He left without a trace. There was the sound of snapping fingers, and Du Yu's body shuddered before he regained control. The golden militarian armor pellet on his head was slightly heavy. What was this all about? Du Yu felt like he was dreaming. After all, fortune and calamity were difficult to predict, so he couldn't help but feel uneasy even though he was holding an extremely valuable treasure in his hand. Die. Over at the Dragon Palace at the bottom of Verdant Bamboo Lake, Lake Lord Inho was the first person to turn pale with fright and exclaim, "There's a huge problem." Yi Han and Fan Weiran also exchanged a glance. Afterward, Yin Qing suddenly raised her head and looked toward the entrance. He Lu, who had been smiling and gazing at Yin Qing the entire time, followed her gaze and also looked toward the entrance. The entire Dragon Palace started to shake violently. Afterward, a young man in white flew to the entrance on his sword, holding the sword scabbard in his hand as he gracefully landed on the ground. He then strode into the palace and returned his sword to his scabbard. In the end, a thunderous explosion rumbled through the lake, yet it landed very far behind the young man in white. There was a smile on Chan Pingan's face, and he continued to walk forward as he held the sword scabbard and lightly pushed the hilt of the sword, causing Sword Immortal to fly out and spin in the air before piercing diagonally into the floor of the Dragon Palace. The sword rested in the floor just like that. Chan Pingan stood still in a carefree manner, with his large and snow-white sleeves billowing as he held one hand behind his back. He then pointed at the sword with his other hand and said with a faint smile, "Please feel free to take the sword, everyone." However, what he said next sent a cold chill through everyone's body. "If you fail to pull out the sword, however, then you can leave your head behind." His third sentence allowed everyone to feel a tiny bit less tense. Of course, this was apart from He Lu, the young man who was also dressed in white. He Lu can go first. He Lu's expression was livid. With old ancestor Fan Weiran as their leader, the Qi refiners from the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, and its subordinate forces all had complicated expressions on their faces. Theoretically speaking, this should have been a rare and entertaining scene. In fact, it should have been a hugely entertaining scene. However, the cultivators were afraid that they would become part of the entertainment after enjoying this enrapturing appetizer. As for the Qi refiners on City Lord Yihan's side, they were all filled with righteous indignance, yet they didn't dare to say a single word. Not a single one of them dared to speak up. The two groups of cultivators all felt intense hatred toward Verdant Bamboo Lake right now. What dog's hit mountain and water formation of the Dragon Palace was this? It was as strong as a block of watery tofu. Lake Lord Inho remained silent, standing still with his head lowered and his gaze locked on the ground. This was very interesting and worth ruminating over. Even wealthy clans would shout in displeasure if one of their unimportant mud walls was knocked over. Yet the Lake Lord remained completely silent after the formation of his dragon palace was shattered apart. This signified a huge loss of immortal coins. Didn't people all say that Verdant Bamboo Lake was the most powerful force in the Silver Screen Nation? Couldn't Lake Lord Inho rival the formal gods of the Five Mountains? The officials and nobles outside the mountains were also extremely respectful toward the Verdant Bamboo Lake, with no one voicing any complaints even when Lake Lord Inho flagrantly wore dragon robes that only emperors could wear. There were indeed some cultivators with low cultivation bases and short tempers who had wanted to step forward and stand up for He Lu, yearning to chide the young immortal who was completely surrounded by cultivators from Verdant Bamboo Lake and the two immortal forces. By stepping forward and causing a scene, these lowly cultivators hoped to earn some goodwill from young immortal He in Yellow Axe City without needing to spend a single copper coin. Before they could do anything, however, they were immediately given warnings through their minds' lakes by the experienced and wise cultivators beside them, their seniors or their good friends. At the end of the day, the cultivators voicing the warnings were also afraid of being dragged down by these rash individuals. This sword immortal was powerful enough to block a heavenly tribulation, so it wouldn't be strange if he accidentally killed a few people when he casually unleashed a ray of sword light. There was no longer a cold smile tugging at Fan Weiron's lips, and she instead appeared slightly expressionless at this moment. City Lord Yihan turned his head, looking at the sword immortal in white who had slashed open the two powerful formations with a single sword strike as he asked, "Sword immortal, do you insist on fighting to the death and ensuring mutual destruction?" Qian Ping'an casually tossed the sword scabbard to the ground, causing it to also pierce into the floor of the dragon palace. He then retrieved the folding fan from beside his waist, neither looking at Yihan nor looking at He Lu as he lightly tapped the fan against his palm. There was a wide smile on his face as his gaze wandered around the room, starting from a white-haired old man sitting cross-legged to his left and shifting his gaze from the front of the palace all the way to the back where the entrance was. Qian Ping'an looked over the cultivators one by one, saying, "I heard that some esteemed immortal from Blissful Dream Peak had a very unique and fresh idea, surprisingly asking a martial arts grandmaster from the cultivation world to eat shit inside a cart of feces. Who came up with this wonderful idea? How about you step forward so I can admire you? If you're too lazy to stand, then raising your hand will also suffice." Standing amid the cultivators from the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, there was a young man and a young woman who exchanged a surprised glance with each other. Wasn't this sword immortal standing in front of them the person in azure who had been wearing a bamboo hat and eating breakfast at a roadside stall outside Imperial Accompanying City that morning? His clothes were different and his demeanor was different, but his appearance was definitely the same as before. The young woman couldn't help but smile bitterly. Her junior brother had truly jinxed the situation. Standing in front of the city gates that morning, the old man who had a small monkey squatting on his shoulder was none other than the culprit who had snatched away the extremely valuable immortal treasure. And now, the young wanderer in azure had turned around and transformed into a formidable sword immortal. Qian Ping'an's gaze eventually settled on a group of Qi refiners sitting near the middle of the Dragon Palace. A man who was sitting relatively closer to the entrance of the palace shrank back in apprehension. Qian Ping'an had asked a question, yet there was no need for the cultivators to say anything for the answer to reveal itself. Indeed, cultivators from the mountains often sought peace and tranquility, and were unwilling to become involved in the troublesome matters of other people. When standing at the entrance of the city god temple and asking for the main official of the Yinyang department before, The minor but tacit reactions of the main official's colleagues had been relatively immediate and resolute. The situation right now was identical. Chan Ping'an raised a hand, and an orb of black mist, the soul of the cultivator who had instructed the young woman to kill the baby, had already shrunk from the size of a fist to the size of a juju pit thanks to the astral aura circling around it. Chan Ping'an gently twirled a finger, causing wisps of astral energy to envelop the orb of black mist and grind it down even further as he smiled and said, "I forgot to ask this vagrant cultivator for his name, but he told me that the official immortals of Blissful Dream Peak were the masterminds behind his actions. However, I'm aware that you likely don't have the brains or the courage, so was Great City Lord Yi the true mastermind, or was young immortal he the true mastermind?" The 4 chi refiners from Blissful Dream Peak gritted their teeth in anger, but they remained seated and unmoving like extremely stable boulders. Chan Ping'an smiled and continued, "You don't need to say anything if you don't want to, but there's just one thing that I'm curious about. Regardless of whether it was the prudent City Lord Yi or the scheming He Lu who tasked you with these matters, did they fork out the funds for you carry out your missions? If they didn't, then Yellow Axe City is far too stingy and unkind." He Lu slowly stood up, with his expression returning to normal as he announced loudly, "I'll take ownership for my own actions, so there's no need for you to yammer about me going first or whatnot. All of the conflicts, gratitude, and resentment of Imperial accompanying city will end with me. He Lu, if I die in battle, then that will naturally mean that Sword Immortal has superior skills, so I won't have any regrets or complaints. What does Sword Immortal say?" Yi Han smiled faintly upon hearing this. If they didn't take this gamble, then everyone present at the banquet hosted by Lake Lord Inho would be disunited like a pile of loose sand, with their minds and ambitions completely incompatible. At that time, the group of cultivators who could theoretically rival an immortal would disintegrate into a useless rabble. Fan Weiran was slightly astonished, and as she looked up, the old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm finally felt some respect for this young man from Yellow Axe City. In the past, she had simply felt like He Lu was a cultivation talent who was no inferior to Little Yen. He was fairly clever and good with people, yet he was unexpectedly calm and composed while walking a tightrope between life and death. This was no easy feat, face as calm as still water while violent thunder boomed in the chest. Such an individual could be appointed a great general. This saying was a perfect fit for He Lu. He possessed both good talent and good disposition, so as long as he didn't die young, he would definitely achieve great success on the path to the Great Tao. Fan Weiran silently pondered on this. Perhaps she should agree to the relationship between Little Yen and He Lu, a match made in heaven. After they overcame this difficult situation at the banquet in the Dragon Palace of Verdant Bamboo Lake, He Lu was an outsider at Yellow Axe City, after all, so he would definitely be unable to succeed Yi Han as the next city lord. That being the case, she could potentially rely on Little Yan's relationship with He Lu to drag him into the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm instead. By doing so, she could weaken Yellow Axe City while strengthening the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm further, and at the same time, she could also anger Yi Han to death. Once the enviable Golden Boy and Jade Girl became Immortal Tao partners and advanced to the Golden Core tier together, Yellow Axe City would face a dismal situation where young talents couldn't replace old talents, meaning that Yi Han would be forced to support Yellow Axe City all by himself. If the conditions were suitable, Fan Weiran could foresee more than half of the Immortal Mountains in the dozen or so nations becoming part of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm's territory in the future. With He Lu's foresight and ambition, Fan Weiran was sure that he understood this very clearly as well. Yi Han, if this person misspeaks even slightly, then he'll incite outrage among all of the cultivators. At that time, we can't let slip the opportunity that He Lu has worked so hard to create, Fan Weiran quickly said using her mind's voice. She then continued, "You and I should put aside our differences today and sincerely cooperate to overcome this challenge. The situation is dire, so we shouldn't hold back and act selfishly anymore." Yi Han firmly agreed with Fan Weiran. "I thought you were going to say that I shouldn't take things too far, and to be lenient where there is room to do so. However, your words just then also proved that you, He Lu, were indeed the one who masterminded all of the schemes at Imperial Accompanying City," Chan Ping'an said. He then smiled and continued, "Since young immortal he is willing to take responsibility, I respect you for being honest and brave. Very well, we'll have everything end with you, He Lu. If you can't pull out the sword, then I'll only take your head today at the Dragon Palace of Verdant Bamboo Lake." He Lu faltered upon hearing this. To say nothing of the others, even Fan Weiran felt slightly more at ease at this moment. The Sword Immortal's reply was truly very unexpected. However, if the conflict today truly ended without breaking out into chaos, then why would Fan Weiran not feel content? She would feel content even if a few more people were killed, as long as the treasure basin Immortal Realm wasn't affected too much. In that case, her secret agreement with Yellow Axe City's Yihan could naturally be scrapped as well. Yihan's expression changed slightly. Chan Ping'an used his folding fan to point at Sword Immortal, which was still diagonally impaled in the ground, saying, "Please don't hold back, young Immortal He. Feel free to retrieve the sword. How many cultivators will feel gratitude toward you after you die today? This will indeed be a worthy death." He Lu could no longer maintain his calm and composed expression, with his gaze shifting slightly and turning toward his master Yihan. A beautiful young woman walked out from behind the dazzling jewel curtains hanging over the side entrance of the palace, exclaiming in anger, "What are you doing, bastard? Why are you so brutish and domineering? So what if you're a sword immortal whom everyone is afraid of? How can cultivators kill people so wantonly and ruthlessly?" The dazzling jewel curtain fell behind her, playing a crisp melody of colliding jade beads as it did so. Lake Lord Inho flared up in rage, not even turning around as he vigorously swept an arm outward and roared, "Go back inside." His furious strike sent the young dragon woman crashing back into the side hall, obliterating the jewel curtain as she violently slammed into a wall. There was only a single impact sound, meaning that her slender figure hadn't fallen to the ground. In other words, she was most likely embedded in the wall. Lake Lord Inho's strike was extremely forceful, and it was clear that he hadn't held back much. Chan Ping'an smiled and looked at the Lake Lord, who was wearing a reddish-purple Dao robe. He then looked around at the palace and remarked, "This is a good place." Lake Lord Inho bowed and said, "It's a great honor to have Sword Immortal grace my small residence with your presence." Chan Ping'an made a tapping motion with the folding fan in his hand, saying with his smile, "The events at the Water Goddess Temple of Peony Stream was the first time, and the warm-up and small fight between us above Verdant Bamboo Lake was the second time. Gathering the cultivators in the Dragon Palace and having a long-distance battle of Dao power with me, while I was at Imperial Accompanying City, was the third time. It's often said that the same mistake can't be made more than 3 times, but taking into account the dragon woman who stepped forward and spoke up in a righteous manner just then, it's already been 4 times now. What should we do about this?" Lake Lord Inho didn't straighten his back and stand up, and he simply looked up slightly and replied in a solemn voice, "Verdant Bamboo Lake will do whatever Sword Immortal commands." Chan Ping'an didn't offer a response to this, and he said in an understanding manner, "There's no rush, Lake Lord. Let's continue this discussion after young Immortal. He attempts to pull out the sword. After all, what if he does manage to somehow pull out the sword? Won't you be stupefied again at that time? By being so cold-hearted and turning against your allies this early, your Dragon Palace might suffer when sharing the spoils afterward, causing you to make much fewer immortal coins." There was a pitiful look in Lake Lord Inho's eyes as he smiled bitterly and said, "Sword Immortal is so humorous." Chan Ping'an used his folding fan to point at the white-haired old man sitting beside He Lu, saying, "It's time for you to step forward and turn around this perilous situation. Otherwise, it will be too late for you to reassure the others with your words and turn the tables with your strength afterward." Yihan heaved a soft sigh. The old man, who had just received some secret instructions from City Lord Yihan, didn't know whether to stand or remain seated. He was between a rock and a hard place. In the end, his might and aura fell drastically as he mustered his courage and stood up, saying, "Then allow this old bag of bones, who's already 1 step in the grave, to boldly say a few things to Sword Immortal?" However, everyone in the Dragon Palace simply heard the Sword Immortal quietly murmur, "What a shame." Moreover, his expression was as if he still yearned for more of the same. Sure enough, the speech and actions of Sword Immortals were completely incomprehensible and impervious to reason. Yanqing turned around, and this was because the innocent-looking little Cui was secretly tugging on her sleeve. Yanqing silently raised a finger, gesturing for the young girl, who always spoke in an unrestrained manner at home, to remain silent. The young girl smiled knowingly and nodded lightly in response, using the ripples of her mind's lake to say to Yanqing, Antmaster Yen. He's engaging in minor cultivation of his mind right now. It appears very strange, and even I can only see a very hazy picture. It's as if he's a woodsman sharpening his hatchet before chopping down firewood. However, I can vaguely sense that he's feeling dissatisfied about the small number of people here. There aren't enough whetstones here, and I can faintly discern the silhouette of an entire city. He's most likely thinking about the many residents of Imperial accompanying city. In any case, this is most likely the situation right now. This person is extremely sly, and he purposely used those incredibly stupid snakes to temper his physique during the battle at Verdant Bamboo Lake before. And now he's doing much the same thing again. Sigh. Antmaster Yen is also aware that I used to always respect and admire the types of sword immortals that Second Ancestor always mentioned and talked about. However, I don't dare to look up to them anymore. They're far too terrifying. Yan Qing found this inconceivable, and little Chui's words caused her to feel even more uneasy and weary. Ever since embarking on the path of cultivation, her mental state had never been as chaotic as it was right now. The immortal technique that the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm used for cultivating the mind was ineffective at this moment, as was her own ability to calm her mind and focus her attention. The Sword Immortal in white suddenly started to talk to himself, appearing slightly exasperated as he muttered, "Alright, I guess this will work if you say so." In reality, this Sword Immortal was nowhere near as handsome as He Lu. However, this was more than made up for by the fact that he was an extraordinarily destructive and deadly sword immortal. The cultivators in the Dragon Palace all felt nervous and fearful at this moment, becoming very paranoid and feeling as if the speech and actions of this sword immortal in white all carried profound meaning pertaining to Tao. This young sword immortal. Chun Ping'an turned to the white-haired old man who had already formulated a speech in his mind and suggested, "It's best for you to keep your mouth shut." A streak of green sword light suddenly materialized in midair, causing the white-haired old man's expression to change drastically. He stomped his foot and shook his sleeves, immediately transforming into an origami glede that was as large as a palm as he started to flee. The green flying sword dashed after the origami glede like an inseparable shadow. The snow-white origami glede fled in a very purposeful manner, and after one of its wings was stabbed by the flying sword as it attempted to soar out the main entrance of the palace, it started to fly over the banquet tables in the hall, using the falling chi refiners and the glasses and bowls on the tables as obstacles to slow down the flying sword. The origami glede was like a nimble sparrow navigating around branches and flowers, as it continued to fly through extremely narrow gaps in a very precarious manner. The chi refiners became pale with fright, yet they didn't dare to unleash abuse at the old man in front of City Lord Yihan and the cultivators of Yellow Axe City. They felt aggrieved and stifled, and they harbored intense fury and resentment toward the old man, hoping that he could die sooner rather than later. Chun Ping'an turned his attention to He Lu and said, "This is my last reminder to you to pull out the sword." He Lu remained silent, but the veins on his hand that was gripping the bamboo flute were already bulging. Yihan slowly stood up, asking in a calm and amicable manner, "Sword Immortal is safe and uninjured, and our immortal forces haven't actually committed any grave crimes deserving of death either. Of course, we have indeed disturbed Sword Immortal's peaceful cultivation over the past few days, so can I personally represent Yellow Axe City to offer Sword Immortal some compensation?" The young Sword Immortal smiled and replied with a nod. Naturally. There was one thing that the city god of Imperial accompanying city said very well. There's nothing in the world that can't be peacefully discussed. Chun Ping'an then made a grabbing motion, summoning Sword Immortal to his hand and casually sweeping it sideways as he continued, "Go on, name your compensation." His actions were far too unexpected, and they had also been unbelievably rapid like a bolt of lightning. When he flicked his wrist and casually sheathed his sword, the cultivators in the Dragon Palace were still oblivious about his actions and intentions. City Lord Yihan, who was renowned for his graceful and refined demeanor in the mountains of the dozen or so nations, suddenly exploded in anger and roared, "Brat, you actually dare to kill someone in front of me?" Everyone's heads whipped around, with their gazes eventually settling on the handsome young man who had reached up to clutch his neck. The immortal bamboo flute in his hand had already slipped and fallen to the floor, ringing continuously like shattering jade. He Lu stumbled back several steps, with blood already starting to seep through his fingers as tears streamed down his face. He clutched his neck tightly with one hand and reached toward Yihan with his other hand, sobbing as he pleaded in a quivering voice. "Save me, father, save me!" Fear suddenly gripped at Fan Weiran's heart, and she immediately felt as if she had been viciously slapped across the face, leaving a stinging sensation on her cheek. She was so furious that her white hair almost stood on end and directly sent flying the golden crown that had been bestowed upon her by a paramount immortal. How impressive of He Lu! And how impressive of Yihan! This father and son had concealed their relationship exceptionally well, and managed to deceive all of the cultivators in the dozen or so nations. If she and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm truly allowed Yanqing and He Lu to become Dao partners, then with the cleverness and strength of Yihan and He Lu, would the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm not be attacking their archenemy with scrumptious meat buns? Yanqing was a simple young woman who was completely focused on cultivation and didn't concern herself with worldly matters, so how could she compete with the sly old fox and the sly young fox who were actually father and son? Taking 10,000 steps back, even if Yanqing didn't help He Lu attack the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm at that time, refusing to betray her master and her immortal force, her Dao heart would still suffer severe damage. Even if Yanqing wanted to respect her master and help the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm oppose Yellow Axe City, she would be completely powerless to do anything once she became Dao partners with He Lu. Fan Wei ran down the contents of her wine cup in satisfaction and exclaimed with loud laughter, "How incredibly satisfying! That bastard He Lu deserves to die. Yihan, your son has been brutally killed. Yet you're not attacking the culprit in fury? You're not going to fight to the death with the sword immortal." Chan Ping'an smiled faintly and said, "You'll also die today, so don't be in such a rush to enter the afterlife and reincarnate." Fan Weiran's delighted laughter stopped abruptly. Yihan was just about to reach forward, yet he immediately retracted his hand again, causing grief and despair to completely overwhelm He Lu. His vision was blurry as he stared at his father who refused to step forward for his sake, and a look of hatred and resentment appeared in his eyes. He then slowly turned his head, causing even more blood to seep through his fingers as he looked at the terrified Yanqing, and said with a pleading look in his eyes, "Yanqing, save me." Yanqing exhaled, turning around to face the sword immortal in white as she held her short sword and stood up, saying, "I'm launching this sword strike for myself." Chan Ping'an clasped his hands behind his back and nodded in response, replying with a faint smile, "People obtain what they seek, whether that be virtue or death. A decent cultivator has finally appeared in this dragon palace that's brimming with filth." Yanqing stood with the short sword in hand, smiling in an uninhibited manner as her mind returned to a pure and tranquil state. She channeled her aura and caused spiritual energy to flow through her entire body, and the dazzling golden crown above her head further made this stunningly beautiful young woman appear like an ethereal immortal. She looked very beautiful at this moment, but all of the Qi refiners in the Dragon Palace still felt extremely confused. He Lu stumbled backward, eventually crashing into a wall and slumping to the ground, falling into a seated position and becoming limp. In the end, a decapitated head fell to the ground. The thud was nowhere near as loud as the thunderous rumble caused by Chan Ping'an's entrance just then, but all of the cultivators felt as if their hearts had been struck by a heavy hammer blow, making it slightly difficult to breathe. Yellow Axe City's He Lu had died just like that. A cultivation prodigy who had the potential to reach the pinnacle of the mountains and stand beside Yihan and Fan Weiran had been decapitated and killed just like that? The cultivators felt even more astonished as they turned around to look at the exceedingly graceful celestial maiden Yanqing. Both of them were the most outstanding prodigies in the mountains of the dozen or so nations. He Lu was a clever and scheming person, and it was only due to bad fortune that he had died in Verdant Bamboo Lake's Dragon Palace, somewhere in a foreign land. However, celestial maiden Yanqing clearly had an opportunity to remove herself from the situation, so why was she acting so foolishly? In any case, how had this golden boy and jade girl, who had almost become immortal Dao partners, gotten together in the first place? Or perhaps the romantic feelings between them were extremely strong, so Yanqing was going to draw her sword and attack in grief and fury after witnessing the death of her lover? However, to attack a genuine sword immortal with a sword? The cultivators weren't looking down on Yanqing, but they felt like doing this would be an act of seeking humiliation. During the critical moment when Yanqing was holding her sword and accumulating power to face off against the young sword immortal, An unexpected commotion suddenly erupted. Near the central region among the group of cultivators on Yihan's side, a banquet table that was filled with extravagant delicacies and fine wine suddenly exploded apart, throwing the qi refiners around it aside and causing them to violently fall into a heap. After suddenly destroying the banquet table without warning, a brawny man radiating with a golden glow strode forward and caused the entire dragon palace to shudder. Afterward, he threw a punch and instantly sent the sword immortal in white flying, causing him to crash through the palace wall. In fact, there were several loud booms in quick succession as he crashed through several more palatial walls. This punch, was it truly a punch that could be unleashed by a lower 5-tier qi refiner from Blissful Dream Peak? Fan Weiran and Yihan quickly exchanged a glance, both seeing the deep shock and terror in each other's eyes. This person had concealed his strength extremely well, and he definitely wasn't a pawn of the two immortal forces. Perhaps he was an ally of the old man with the small monkey, and the Fox Spirit Empress of the Silver Screen Nation. Fan Weiran and Yihan were at the Golden Core tier, yet even they would have failed to withstand this punch if they were taken by surprise and not given an opportunity to properly defend themselves. They would have definitely suffered severe wounds. After enjoying the satisfaction of unleashing a punch that contained the pinnacle fist intent of his life, the seemingly unremarkable man surprisingly had his arm shattered due to the impact and hang limply by his side. However, he was filled with vigor and confidence as he peered down on the other cultivators in the palace, exclaiming with loud laughter, "This trump card should have been reserved for old criminal Xia Zhan if I had the opportunity," but it was unexpectedly stolen away by a naive young man who liked to put on airs and show off. The brawny man looked through the numerous broken walls, gazing at the large plumes of dust and smoke in the distance as he continued. "And I was thinking that it was unreasonable for a sword immortal like you to possess the physique of a Vajrabhati tier martial artist. How are things now? Do you still possess the physique of a Vajrabhati tier martial artist? Even genuine Vajrabhati tier martial artists will have their internal organs pulverized by my punch, killing them on the spot." He spat out a mouthful of blood, glancing at the sheathed sword on the ground as he spat. "Sword immortal my arse. Who the fuck do you think you are? I tolerated you for a long time, and you genuinely thought that you were invincible after killing a measly C observation tier amateur." The corners of Lake Lord Inho's lips curled up into a smile that became wider and wider, with a look of delight eventually spreading across his entire face. Fan Weiran also started to smile. Even though Yihan also felt a strong sense of relief, he felt gloomy and couldn't bring himself to smile when he glanced at the headless corpse slumped against the wall. Fortunately, his youngest son, who had concealed his identity this entire time, was ultimately a C observation tier cultivator, and had already gathered his soul in several critical acupoints. However, where would they find such an outstanding innate body in the future? One that possessed the aptitude of so-called immortal golden branch and jade leaves? How could he advance to the golden core tier in the future? How could he become stronger and more capable than his father, leading Yellow Axe City to greater heights atop the peak of the mountains? The three other qi refiners from Blissful Dream Peak gulped in apprehension upon seeing the powerful punch of the brawny man. This useless junior brother of theirs, who usually wasn't even able to brandish his weapons properly, had suddenly transformed into a top-notch martial arts grandmaster who could unleash thunderous and explosively powerful punches. Yanqing dazedly stood on the spot. Even though the cultivators in the palace didn't necessarily know whether the fabled Vajrabhati tier martial artist's superior grandmaster was friend or foe, they still started to shout in approval and slam the tables in delight. In fact, some cultivators even threw their heads back and down their drinks, raising their thumbs at the pure martial artist. There were even those who started to praise the Blissful Dream Nation, saying that not only was its scholarly fortune flourishing, but its martial fortune was flourishing as well. They claimed that the Blissful Dream Nation should become the dominant nation of a region, and annex the nations in its surroundings, perhaps allowing it to become a powerful empire in the process. Yanqing's heart felt empty as she stood in the boisterous and extremely joyful Dragon Palace. Fan Weiran's entire body was swaying back and forth as she roared with laughter, and she also emulated the actions of those crude cultivators as she raised a thumb and praised, "Little Yan, you've truly provided remarkable service this time. Well done, young lady. When we return to the treasure basin immortal realm, I'll definitely bestow that valuable treasure in the ancestral hall to you. Who will dare to oppose this?" The first person who noticed something amiss was the blinking little Cui. This time, however, she didn't even dare to speak using the ripples of her mind's lake, to say nothing of making other small movements. The innocent young girl sat upright and started to act like a wooden puppet. The next person to notice something amiss was the powerful martial artist from the blissful Dream Nation, who had secretly advanced to the Vajrabhati tier one step at a time. When his expression gradually became solemn, Yihan and Fan Weiran noticed the dire turn of events as well. Lake Lord Inho had initially wanted to become acquainted with the brawny martial artist, but he also wiped the smile from his face and hurriedly calmed his breathing and focused his attention at this moment. A sword immortal in white walked through the large entrances in the walls and eventually reappeared in the main hall of the Dragon Palace. Some of the chi refiners on Fan Weiran's side had frantically rolled and crawled out of the way already, clearing a path for the sword immortal and the Vajrabhati tier martial artist. They saw the sword immortal pat his shoulder and shake his snow-white sleeves, after which he smiled with squinted eyes and said, "When I was traveling on an immortal ship before, someone said that the golden core tier chi refiners in this area are all papier-mâché." Chan Ping'an slowly walked toward the martial artist from the blissful Dream Nation as he said this, and was there any sign of his internal organs being completely pulverized? Chan Ping'an smiled as he walked forward and continued, "By the looks of it, the Vajrabhati tier martial artists in this area aren't any better. You're like a pile of wet mud that hasn't even been bashed dry yet, and it's because of this that you've broken your own arm. Does it hurt?" The brawny man's voice was solemn as he exclaimed, "You're actually a far-roaming tier martial artist, aren't you? You're not a sword immortal at all, am I right? Tell me the truth before you throw a punch." Chan Ping'an held a hand to his belly and held a hand to his forehead, saying with an exasperated expression, "Don't be like this, brother. I'm serious. You've already told so many jokes in the Dragon Palace today, and after being fortunate enough to survive the heavenly tribulation at Imperial Accompanying City, I might actually die of laughter here thanks to you." Lake Lord Inho sighed in grief and sat down on the steps, holding his head in his hands as he resigned himself to the situation. "Go on and fight to your heart's content. You guys can cause as much commotion as you want. You can even demolish my Dragon Palace if you please, and I'll adopt that sword immortal's surname in the future if I so much as frown." Some young cultivators wanted to laugh but didn't dare to do so. Chan Ping'an turned his gaze to Fan Weiran and Lake Lord Inho and asked, "Were you two the ones responsible for spreading the news that I possessed the physique of a Vajrabhati tier martial artist? Are the two of you aware that you ruined a number of my plans with your coincidentally correct guess?" The brawny martial artist took a deep breath and smiled, showing no intention at all to step back and relent. He placed his right foot backward and raised his unbroken arm, causing his fist aura to become full as he replied, "What does it matter whether you're a martial artist at the same tier as me or a sword immortal who flies around in the sky? Let me have a taste of your strength again." Chan Ping'an glanced at the three other cultivators from Blissful Dream Peak before retracting his gaze and chuckling. "It seems like the Blissful Dream Nation is truly filled with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. This is quite interesting. Thanks for alerting me to this." The brawny martial artist stepped forward, with his fist intent flowing like water and causing the entire palace to shake, with almost all of the banquet tables flying into the air. Just as everyone thought that another intense and deadly battle was about to take place, the brawny martial artist surprisingly leaned back, traveling as fast as lightning as he crashed toward the unopened walls behind him. After crashing through the walls with a loud boom, he instantly disappeared without a trace as if he were using an immortal inch movement technique. This was as expected of a Vajrabhati tier martial artist, a lofty elite that hadn't appeared in the dozen or so nations for 200 years. His movement techniques were indeed unpredictable and difficult to guard against. However, the sword immortal in white also disappeared from the palace. After a while, the fabled Vajrabhati tier martial artist walked backward and slowly returned through the broken walls step by step. Unfortunately, however, there was a hand and a large sleeve sticking through the brawny martial artist's chest. Not only did this hand instantly stop the martial arts superior grandmaster's escape, but it also decided his life and death in an instant. After all, Chan Ping'an's left hand had directly pierced through the brawny martial artist's chest and exited through his back. Chan Ping'an raised his right hand and placed it on the brawny martial artist's head, giving it a light push. The brawny martial artist weakly flew back and coincidentally landed in the middle of the palace. Chen Ping'an shook his sleeve, instantly causing a splatter of sanguine blood to appear on the floor beside him. Meanwhile, the origami glede was still frantically flying around the palace and fleeing from the wisp of dark green sword light that was relentlessly pursuing it. Still haven't had enough fun yet? Chen Ping'an asked with a faint smile. The dark green flying sword suddenly increased its speed, shredding the origami glede to pieces and causing the mangled and bloody old man to loudly thud to the floor. The flying sword leisurely flew back to its master's side, appearing like an obedient little bird as it slowly circled him in a gentle and docile manner. Chen Ping'an shot a glance at the young girl wearing a green dress, and little Cui grinned at him in response. Chen Ping'an also smiled, saying, "Of Yellow Axe City's He Lu, the Treasure Basin Immortal Realms Yanqing, and Verdant Bamboo Lake's Lake Lord Yin Ho, did not a single one of these three people inform the others that it would be best to directly place the battleground at Imperial Accompanying City? I would have perhaps been the most restricted over there, while you would have enjoyed the greatest chance of success. Killing me might have been difficult, but you would have had a better chance to flee." Lake Lord Yin Ho put his hands down and looked up, replying, "I did mention this before, Sword Immortal, and He Lu also agreed to my proposal. He even came up with many intricate and interlinked plans, for example, using all kinds of immortal techniques to envelop the commoners and force them to directly charge to the ghost residents. In the end, however, both sides felt like staying too close to Imperial Accompanying City would increase the risk of being targeted by Great Sword Immortal, someone who's able to use his flying sword to kill someone 1,000 paces away. No one was willing to sacrifice themselves first, and the lives of the cultivators from Yellow Axe City and the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm are also very valuable. Without these cultivators volunteering to act first, the cultivators from the vassal immortal forces aren't completely stupid either, so no one was willing to sacrifice themselves for money that they wouldn't be able to spend. They argued incessantly, and they could only abandon these plans in the end. Sword Immortal, I've already said everything that I should say and shouldn't say. You can feel free to kill whomever you want now. And so be it if I lose my dragon palace and my 1,000-year-long reign. When this is over, and if Sword Immortal is willing to act benevolently and spare me, then Verdant Bamboo Lake will definitely repair the mountain and water fortune of Imperial Accompanying City. I'll treat this as a form of repenting for my crimes." Upon hearing Lake Lord Yin Ho's first remark, Yan Qing's entire body started to shake, with her face also becoming as white as a sheet. Her Tao heart was unstable. Her acupoints and spiritual energy were unstable, and her sword-gripping hand was even more unstable. Chen Ping'an put his index finger and middle finger together before making a light sweeping motion. Yellow Axe City's City Lord Yihan surprisingly remained still on purpose, allowing Chen Ping'an's sword to pierce through his chest and nail him to the wall. Meanwhile, a dark green flying sword with a slightly quivering sword tip hovered 1 foot from Fan Weiron's glabella. The old woman also remained unmoving. "You people are truly the smartest, with each being better than the other at analyzing the situation and acting appropriately. I truly admire you people in this respect, and I'm definitely not saying this in ridicule." Chen Ping'an sighed and clasped his hands behind his back, slowly walking forward and catching a glimpse of a wine pot as he did so. He casually summoned the wine pot over, holding it in one hand and holding a cup in his other hand. He poured himself a cup of wine and took a sip, with a wide smile appearing on his face as he continued. If there were several more He Lus present, or if the residents of Imperial Accompanying City were able to witness this scene, they would definitely scold me for being a domineering sword immortal. The residents would boil with fury, and they would loudly question my right to wantonly kill people whom I've only seen a few times. After all, we haven't genuinely fought to the death, and there aren't broken limbs and streams of blood littered around the floor. So what right do I have to determine whether someone is good or bad and thus determine their life and death? For what reason must I be so unrelenting and kill so many people? This shows a complete lack of benevolence and kindness, so I'm presumably the same kind of person as those whom I'm killing. Chen Ping'an's words sent a cold chill down everyone's spine. Judging from this powerful sword immortal's words, things still weren't over yet? Chen Ping'an looked toward the old woman sitting at the front and said, "You're a bit more fortunate, and you don't have a good son like He Lu, so we can discuss things calmly." He then turned around and glanced at Yihan, continuing, "However, it's a different story for City Lord Yi. The eyelashes of the young girl wearing a green dress quivered slightly. She remained unmoving like a meditating old monk, with her body unmoving, her heart unmoving, and everything about her unmoving. She simply relied on the strange mystical ability that her old ancestor had seemingly bestowed upon her to secretly take a glance at the situation. Jian Lai suddenly stopped, and it was as if he instantly lost his demeanor as a sword immortal at this instant. There was a tired expression on his face, with his eyes appearing dull just like the fading golden glow around the sword that had pierced through Yi Han's chest and nailed him to the wall. He looked around and poured himself another cup of wine, casually tossing the wine pot back to its original spot before slowly tipping the wine cup forward and pouring its contents out in front of him. It was as if Jian Lai were offering wine to someone's tomb as he murmured to himself. After the heavenly tribulation passed, the residents of Imperial Accompanying City who had sincerely offered incense and kowtowed in front of the city god temple had simply been going with the flow to feel at ease. They're genuinely weak and fragile, and the large majority of them will very likely be oblivious to the truth for their entire lives, especially those who choose to remain silent. As such, some of them incorrectly worship the city god, while some of them very correctly worship the fire god. My feelings toward these commoners are similar to how some of you cultivators keep your distance from the mortal world, cultivating in peace and looking down on mortal matters. I neither like nor dislike these commoners, and I can't say whether they're necessarily correct or incorrect. There are hundreds upon thousands of paths of the great Tao, so which path can't be chosen and embarked on? What do you say, fire god of Imperial Accompanying City? In the end, you seemingly didn't stand atop the roof of your shrine and scold me? Instead, you charged toward the heavenly tribulation yourself, causing your godly body to shatter into two. I was genuinely unable to speak at that time, or else I would have definitely scolded you and sent you flying back to the fire god shrine with a single punch. It was only a small heavenly tribulation, so could it have possibly killed me? I was only pushed to the brink of death. However, I can also be regarded as a cultivator, so is there anything to fear about becoming half dead? I analyzed and calculated many things beforehand, but I didn't have enough time to inform you about these matters because we met each other too late. Of course, I wouldn't have revealed these matters to you even if we had met earlier. After all, the heart and the mind are unpredictable. So who dares to so easily trust other people? As he spoke, there was a soft plop at Fan Weiron's glabella. The old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal sect fell backward as if she had been struck by a hammer blow. Meanwhile, Yi Han was still unharmed, and he simply looked to be in a dire state as he was nailed against the wall. However, Fan Weiron definitely hadn't been killed for good, and this was clear from the fact that her appearance and body instantly withered on the spot, following which an abnormal energy fluctuation appeared in the Dragon Palace before disappearing in a flash. Jian Lai appeared slightly exasperated and helpless as he crushed the wine cup in his hand. There was nothing he could do right now since the pure jade illumination talisman had already been used and destroyed. Otherwise, the talisman from the esteemed Mystery Department's lofty Cloud Palace would have been able to deal with this immortal technique regardless of how peculiar and unpredictable it was. Even though Fan Weiron's Yin soul had dispersed like mist, concealing her golden core in the process, the talisman would have instantly enveloped an area of several kilometers in radius in an instant, most likely preventing the old ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm from fleeing. However, Jian Lai was currently unable to draw talismans after his great battle with the heavenly tribulation. In any case, the talismans from the authentic death-avoiding book that he was skilled at drawing were all unsuitable for the current scenario. This was why there existed the saying that cultivators from the mountains were easy to defeat but difficult to kill. This was especially the case for chi refiners who had reached the golden core tier, since which of them wouldn't have several life-saving trump cards? Meanwhile, things were much more straightforward for pure martial artists, where a loss in battle would often mean death. However, having Fan Weiron escape didn't matter as her golden crown still remained in the Dragon Palace. Perhaps she was unable to take the golden crown with her, or perhaps taking it would have exposed her whereabouts, but she was too afraid of Jian Lai's flying sword. Jian Lai retrieved his folding fan and slowly opened it with 2 fingers, asking with a faint smile, "What's this? Do you people believe whatever I say? Then what if I tell you that I'm not a sword cultivator at all, and that I'm actually a 6th-tier martial artist? Would you believe me?" Chun Ping'an turned to a cultivator from Blissful Dream Peak and asked, "What do you think?" The cultivator directly kneeled down and shouted at the top of his lungs, "I'll believe whatever Sword Immortal says." Chun Ping'an turned around and looked at the young man and the young woman who were both carrying swords, saying, "Oh, what a coincidence. We meet again. Did the two of you obtain anything from your trip to Imperial Accompanying City?" The young man immediately fell on his backside in fright. "No, Sword Immortal, we didn't obtain anything," the young woman replied in a soft voice. Chun Ping'an smiled and asked, "Did the old man with the small monkey on his shoulder not target the two of you during the chaotic battle?" "We immediately fled far away when we realized it was him," the young woman replied with a bitter expression. Chun Ping'an nodded and said, "That was the correct decision. Tell your junior brother to improve his attitude in the future, and when he leaves the mountains to travel through the cultivation world again, it would do him good to look more and speak less." This was a rare display of friendliness from the unpredictable young Sword Immortal. Yet the young woman couldn't bring herself to feel happy no matter what. She felt like everything was over, and it was inevitable that she and her junior brother would be reprimanded soon. He Lu, a Vajrabhati tier martial artist from the Blissful Dream Nation, Fan Weiran, the guest elder from Yellow Axe City, and City Lord Yihan had all been wounded or killed. Which person had enjoyed a good outcome after speaking with this Sword Immortal? Chun Ping'an rubbed his glabella and frowned slightly. However, his expression quickly relaxed as he smiled and said, "To encounter each other is fate. The two of you can leave first." The young man who had collapsed on the ground hurriedly crawled up and sprinted toward the entrance of the palace. His senior sister couldn't stop him in time, and she felt like a bloody scene of his head being hacked off by a flying sword was imminently about to play out. Unexpectedly, however, her junior brother was not only able to run far away, but he was even able to shout in a frantic voice, "Hurry up, senior sister." The young woman looked at the Sword Immortal in white whose eyes were gentle like the spring breeze yet profound like the abyss, hesitating for a moment before bowing in respect and saying, "Thank you for showing us mercy, Sword Immortal." She was filled with apprehension as she channeled her spiritual energy and slowly flew out of the chaotic dragon palace. Chun Ping'an walked forward onto the steps where Lake Lord Inho was sitting. As for the flying sword, it continued to circle around the Sword Immortal in white. "Feel free to do whatever you want, Sword Immortal. In any case, I won't move a single finger or have a single crooked thought today, even if you pummel me to death." However, Chun Ping'an didn't sit down on the dragon throne that was like the throne of an emperor, and he instead tapped it with his fingers as if he were appraising a treasure. Chun Ping'an placed a hand on the armrest of the dragon throne and turned around to face the cultivators in the dragon palace, saying, "My judgment is poor, so I'm unable to determine whether a person is good or bad. In that case, I'll just pretend that half of you are good and half of you are bad. In other words, half of the people here are going to die tonight. Some of you might be very good friends, and some of you might be arch enemies who yearn to kill each other. Regardless, I'm sure that you're all aware of each other's backgrounds and histories. So tell me who has committed what bad deeds. Try to pick the more severe cases to talk about. The more shocking the crime, the better. If others have committed a crime that you haven't, then doesn't that make you a good person in comparison? And if you're a good person, then you have a chance to leave here alive." The dragon palace was deathly silent. Chun Ping'an smiled and added, "I forgot to say, but the battles and schemes pertaining to the immortal forces in the mountains don't count. I only care about the matters outside the mountains tonight." A crisp and youthful voice suddenly sounded at this moment, saying, "It's still daytime, Sword Immortal, so you shouldn't say tonight." Chun Ping'an looked toward the person who had spoken. It was none other than the young girl wearing a green dress, and judging from the position of her seat, she was a relatively prized disciple of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. Chun Ping'an smiled and said, "Thank you for the reminder. It's very brightly lit inside the Dragon Palace, so I mistakenly thought that it was nighttime already. As it turns out, Sword Immortal's sword isn't actually an immortal treasure, so this is how it is. However, this makes much more sense," Yihan suddenly said. Chun Ping'an shook a hand and replied, "I know that Golden Core tier cultivators like you have a myriad of techniques and trump cards, so hurry up and piss off." Yihan laughed heartily and directly walked forward, allowing the long sword to completely pierce through his body and remain embedded in the wall. He then sighed and said, I never imagined that Yellow Axe City would fall to such a pitiful state. My son who had the best chance to inherit the city is dead, the chief guest elder is dead, and the foundations of my great Tao have also been damaged, leaving me unable to take another step forward for the rest of my life. Sword Immortal, what do you want me to do so that you won't pursue me to Yellow Axe City and completely exterminate my immortal force? Qian Pingan smiled faintly and replied, This is very simple. Since I can't shatter your golden core, you don't need to stay here to try and trick me anymore. You should make haste and look for your backer. After the heavenly tribulation passed back then, he did appear for a moment above Imperial accompanying city. If my guess isn't wrong, there's definitely some sort of relationship between you and him. His cultivation base is very high, and he's caused me to suffer quite a bit, so we can deal with both the old debts and the new debts when he comes. If he can also bring over the hidden mastermind who managed to obtain the valuable treasure to target me, then that will be quite an impressive feat from you, Yihan. At that time, my only option would be to turn around and flee. There's a canal master serving this lake lord of ours who has a very good saying engraved on the plaque in her shrine. Flowing rivers never dry. Since Sword Immortal has already exposed the secret, is the only option left for us to fight to the death? Will you refuse to let me take away He Lu's soul? Yihan asked in helplessness. Qian Pingan smiled and replied, I want to say that you should take away young immortal He's 3 immortal souls and 7 mortal forms, as that will allow me to detect some traces when you flee into the distance. But even if I make this offer, will you, Yihan, dare to do this? I predict not. Yihan nodded and said, I indeed won't do this. Then as Sword Immortal said just then, flowing rivers never dry. The city lord of Yellow Axe City directly crushed the jade tablet hanging beside his waist. His body vanished without a trace. Qian Pingan looked up at the ceiling, and it was as if his gaze had already reached someplace far away on verdant bamboo lake. The land-shortening effect of this jade tablet was surprisingly even better than that of a golden inch movement talisman. Qian Pingan pinched his glabella. He had a massive headache. There was a flash of gold as the long sword flew out from the wall and pierced into a critical acupoint on He Lu's headless corpse. A cloud of black smoke surged out from He Lu's body, instantly transforming into 10 smaller wisps that attempted to flee in different directions. However, Qian Pingan flicked his sleeve and slammed the wisps of black smoke into the walls, transforming them into lifeless ashes. He looked up with his expression much more at ease as he said, All right, you people can start to speak reason now. You need to cherish this opportunity, as I'm sure that you've seldom had any opportunity to speak reason to save your life after embarking on the path of cultivation. Qian Pingan made a grabbing motion, and the long sword sheathed itself in midair before flying into his palm. He sat down on the dragon throne and placed the sword horizontally across his knees. Yanqing looked at the Sword Immortal in white sitting on the throne atop the platform and remarked in a solemn voice, You truly appear very frightening when you become like this. Qian Pingan smiled faintly and concurred, To say nothing of you people, even I feel afraid of myself at this moment. Little Cui, the young girl wearing a green dress, hurriedly grabbed Yanqing's wrist, with panic on her face and tears in her eyes as she pleaded using her mind's voice. Aunt Master Yan, please don't say anything else truly. He already wanted to kill you 2 times before this, and his killing intent was as genuine as could be. Adding to that his killing intent just then, and Aunt Master Yan has already reached his so-called limit of the same mistakes not being made more than 3 times. This Sword Immortal speaks in a mysterious and unpredictable manner, but his overall intentions can't lie to me. I'm begging you, Aunt Master Yan, okay? Out of everyone in the immortal force, only you and Second Ancestor treat me sincerely. I don't want you to die as well. Qian Pingan rested his forearm on the armrest of the dragon throne, leaning sideways and sitting in a lazy posture as he warned, I'll randomly kill a few people if no one speaks. And thus, someone spoke up and exposed the crimes of another Qi refiner. The exposed Qi refiner was an abode-tier cultivator from an enemy force. This cultivator's immortal force wasn't strong, and his cultivation base wasn't high, but he had committed quite a large number of sinister deeds. Of course, his accuser had carefully cherry-picked what to talk about. They were walking on the tightrope between life and death, so if they didn't use their brains now, were they perhaps going to complain about their wrongful death in the halls of the underworld? The dragon palace at the bottom of verdant bamboo lake was brightly lit, making it difficult to determine whether it was day or night. The crescent moon had already risen above the hanging willows beside the lake, painting a peaceful and tranquil picture. The lights at Imperial accompanying city had also been extinguished, with the lanterns being taken down and the residents closing their doors tightly and not daring to keep any lamps on, lest they attract unnecessary trouble. The lake water parted, making way for a young sword immortal in white who was carrying a sword on his back. Standing beside him was the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake, who was feeling much more reassured right now. As for the scenes inside the Dragon Palace, more than half of the cultivators had been executed after a long period of accusations and commotion. It wasn't just half of them who had been killed as promised by the Sword Immortal beforehand. However, the cultivators who were fortunate enough to survive didn't feel like the esteemed Sword Immortal had a bad temper. They had managed to survive after all, so should they not be content? A translucent and exquisite porcelain bottle appeared in Chan Pingan's hand. Inside this bottle was gently swaying turquoise water, and not only was this bottle of water fortune essence rare and valuable, but it was also like a timely bout of rain for his body. Chan Pingan smiled faintly and asked, "Lake Lord, do you think your fortune is good or bad?" Lake Lord Yin Ho, who had already lost his reddish-purple Dao robe, smiled and replied, "I won't think about this at all. As the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake, I'll definitely protect and properly oversee this region in the future. I don't dare to make any promises as large as the sea regarding matters further in the future, but I'll dutifully carry out Sword Immortal's orders and maintain 100 years of good weather and good harvest in the jurisdiction of Verdant Bamboo Lake. There won't be any natural disasters, and as instructed by Sword Immortal, I won't interfere with any of the man-made disasters." Promises as large as the sea? This is quite a good saying for water gods such as you, Chan Pingan commented. He then smiled and continued, "Make sure you don't forget the other matter either." Lake Lord Yin Ho bowed his head and cupped his fists, saying, "Rest assured, Sword Immortal, I'll definitely keep this in mind. If I fail to accomplish this task, then Sword Immortal can hack me to death with a single sword strike when you return from your travels through Verdant Bamboo Lake in the future." The Sword Immortal in white flew away on his sword. Not only did Lake Lord Yin Ho lose his reddish-purple dragon robe, but he even lost his dragon throne as well. He didn't straighten his back for a long time, and he only breathed a long sigh of relief when he estimated that the young Sword Immortal had already traveled 50 or so kilometers away. He unexpectedly felt like just surviving was already a huge source of joy. The Great Tao was impermanent and unpredictable, and tonight's events were a perfect example of this. When punishing the cultivators in the Great Hall of his Dragon Palace just then, why had that Sword Immortal appeared like a city god justly giving out reward and punishment? How very strange. This was perhaps the eccentric nature of true Sword Immortals. Two female cultivators rose through the water and appeared on the surface of the lake. However, Lake Lord Yin Ho no longer felt attracted when he saw that stunningly beautiful young woman, and he instead felt like just taking a single glance at her was burning his eyeballs. It was these cultivators from the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm who had caused this huge calamity. Lake Lord Yin Ho humphed coldly before leaving through the lake water. "That Sword Immortal is so greedy," the young girl wearing a green dress grumbled. After obtaining old ancestor Fan's golden crown, he actually insisted on taking Aunt Master Yan's golden crown as well. So be it if this were all, but he was even shameless enough to ask whether we had any lesser heat coins. Sure enough, I was right to not admire that Sword Immortal. Opportunistic Sword Immortals like him don't possess the demeanor of true Sword Immortals at all. As it turned out, Yin Qing had already lost the golden crown on her head. She held little Chui's hand and gazed into the distance, with her expression adrift as she smiled faintly and replied, "That's right. Why should little Chui look up to people like this?" The young girl hugged Yin Qing's arm, lightly swaying it back and forth as she asked in an innocent manner, "Aunt Master Yen, why aren't we returning to the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm with the others? The world outside is so dangerous." Yin Qing suddenly smiled and suggested, "Little Chui, let's not return to the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm first. How about we travel around the cultivation world instead?" Little Chui thought about this for a moment before smiling widely and replying with a bright glow on her face, "All right. I've always wanted to secretly drink some wine." Die. After the cultivator scattered from the dragon palace at the bottom of verdant bamboo lake, the sword immortal in white flew into the city on his flying sword. Yet he didn't directly make his way to the ghost residence. Rather, he placed his sword on his back before landing in a small and gloomy alley, bending down to pick up a lesser heat coin. Holding the immortal coin in one hand, he used the folding fan in his other hand to smack his forehead. There was a sullen expression on his face, and it was as if he felt utterly embarrassed as he murmured, "You're going to pick up this kind of dirty money as well? You already obtained a bountiful yield in the Dragon Palace, so there's no need to stoop this low, is there? Forget about it. Leaving the immortal coin here is a waste. I haven't lived like a proper cultivator for all these years, and I haven't done badly when it comes to earning money, cultivating, and practicing fist techniques. Who's going to back down and relent? Killing a nascent tier cultivator might be exceedingly difficult, but have I ever lost against myself before? Alright, I concede that I have, and they were quite miserable losses as well. At the end of the day, however, does that not point to my own impressive abilities? Perhaps only Jiang Shangzhen or the esteemed Mystery Department's Yang Ningxing would be able to understand these murmurings of Qian Pingyuan. With his large white sleeves fluttering back and forth, Qian Pingyuan leisurely made his way back to the ghost residence. He would occasionally walk past some door gods that had nurtured a speck of spiritual light, yet these specks of light would instantly retreat and go into hiding when he walked past. With a tap of his foot, Qian Pingyuan leaped over the wall of the ghost residence and landed in the courtyard. He immediately narrowed his eyes when he stood still. Yu was given a huge fright, and his expression was as if he had seen a ghost during the day. He hurriedly spread a hand apart, revealing the militarian armor pellet that was worth many suits of divine dew-bearing armors. Even though his teeth were chattering, he still summoned his courage and explained everything in a single breath, saying, "Senior, a person who called himself Zhou Fei to begin with and then Jiang Shangzhen afterward claimed that he was a good friend of yours. He snatched away the little child and used an immortal technique to freeze me to the spot, not allowing me to move a single muscle. I wasn't even able to challenge him and fight to the death. In the end, he also said that the orphan had cultivation aptitude, so he would bring him back to the eastern treasured vile continent, and that Senior doesn't need to feel worried. Senior can feel at ease and continue to travel north." Qian Pingyuan nodded and casually grabbed Sword Immortal, sending it flying with a single sweep of his arm and causing the sheathed sword to impale itself into a corridor pillar. He then sat down on the bamboo chair and retied his sword nurturing gourd, waiting for 15th to happily return inside before he lay down and replied slowly, "I understand. You can keep the golden crow armor, and you don't need to be polite with that person when he gives you something. In any case, he's very rich and can't spend his money fast enough." Yu was overjoyed, and he was unable to suppress his smile no matter how hard he tried. He could finally sit down on the small stool and feel at ease as he carefully examined the incredibly valuable militarian armor pellet. Qian Pingyuan glanced at him and chuckled. "I won't stay here for very long, so we'll each go our own way after we leave the city together. However, let me say this first regarding your future life, death, fortune and misfortune. I can only say that you won't face certain death, and I've already told the Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake that I'll still return south after my journey to the north. This can be viewed as a defensive talisman for you, but it can't be regarded as a life-saving talisman. If my guess isn't wrong, then there exists two instead of one powerful cultivator behind these schemes and events at Imperial Accompanying City. Fortunately, one of these cultivators very likely has a relationship with the Blissful Dream Nation and has already achieved their aim. As such, they still have a reason to kill me, but they won't feel a very strong urge to do so. Of course, the best-case scenario is that they don't target me at all, and that I don't die in the north. That way, your so-called defensive talisman will continue to be effective. I'm ultimately not your ancestor or your parent, so you can pray for your own fortune in the future. If you're killed by someone in the future, I can say that the culprit will definitely be a cultivator who's at least at the nascent tier. At that time, I'll simply try my best to take revenge for you." There were some things that Qian Pingyuan didn't say. For example, Jiang Shangzhen would never drag his feet and do things in halves. Apart from meeting Yu in the ghost residence, there were perhaps some matters that Jiang Shangzhen had felt were beneath himself to explain to this outsider. Jiang Shangzhen was an official immortal, But Qian Ping'an felt like he was an official immortal who acted even more vagrant than legitimate vagrant cultivators. Qian Ping'an was well aware of just how difficult it could be to deal with vagrant cultivators. For example, Lu Laoqing from Bamboo Scroll Lake's Palace Willow Island and Lu Jimao from Bamboo Scroll Lake's Cyan Gorge Island. Moreover, Zhang Shangzhen was truly very wealthy. In fact, Qian Ping'an didn't dare to say for sure who owned more immortal treasures between Cui Dongshan and Jiang Shangzhen. He could envision the two of them sitting on small stools and snacking on roasted seeds, not engaging in a fist fight and instead retrieving their immortal treasures and launching them at each other. Perhaps they could entertain themselves for an entire night like this? And that's why it was important to make more money. Of course, there was also the little child who had mysteriously fallen into a so-called nest of money, so this could be regarded as a favor that Qian Ping'an owed Jiang Shangzhen as well. Moreover, this wasn't a small favor. This caused Qian Ping'an to feel slightly helpless. Diyu carefully contemplated things for a moment before slowly placing the golden crow armor inside his sleeve. It was truly fucking heavy. He was all smiles as he said, "Senior, I'm not trying to praise myself or anything, but I feel much more courageous now after having experienced so many things with you." Qian Ping'an looked at Diyu. Diyu chuckled and remarked, "I should piss off." He was scolding himself first so that the mighty senior didn't need to do so. Qian Ping'an opened his folding fan and lightly rocked it back and forth, saying with a dazzling smile, "Oh my, brother Duyu's flattery skills have improved after coming across Jiang Shangzhen." Diyu smiled and replied, "I don't dare to accept such praise. Senior Jiang is Senior Chen's good friend, so how can a junior among juniors like me possibly compare to him?" Qian Ping'an closed his eyes and said with a faint smile, "You're starting to speak repulsively again." Diyu scratched his head. Qian Ping'an tasked him with a strange matter the next day, asking him to visit the shops in Imperial Accompanying City to buy a spring couplet, a pair of door gods, a spring character, and a fortune character. Diyu felt very uneasy. He wasn't afraid of someone throwing feces at him after he left the ghost residence, but he was instead afraid of immortals from the pinnacle of the mountains, such as Old Ancestor Fan or City Lord Yi, choosing a weaker target like him to pick on. He was afraid that they would kill him in a single strike before running away. The mighty senior hadn't said anything regarding his trip to Verdant Bamboo Lake last night, so Diyu hadn't dared to ask any questions. Diyu was filled with fear and trepidation as he purchased the items that he had never before touched in his life, and not only did he pay for them, but he even gave the shopkeeper some extra pieces of loose silver. Fucking hell, he was going to be kind and generous every single day from now on. In fact, Diyu would feel the need to proactively apologize if he accidentally scared some random child on the street. After returning to the ghost residence with no incident and his body intact, Diyu stood outside the door with a bag of goods on his back. He wiped away some sweat, thinking to himself that the cultivation world was truly dangerous and filled with perilous danger around every corner. Sure enough, he felt safer and more at ease around the mighty senior. Right now, Diyu felt like any random person on the street was a lofty cultivator concealing their strength. Afterward, the mighty senior took the bag of items and didn't ask for Duyu's help as he put up the door gods and the spring couplet by himself. After doing this, he also put up the spring character and the fortune character. When Qian Ping'an finished sticking up the final spring character, he stepped back and looked up in dazed silence. Diyu involuntarily recalled the mighty senior's remark about a brief moment of intimacy before, saying that this was a very good phrase that shouldn't be sullied. The two of them left the ghost residence. The mighty senior paid a visit to the ruins of the fire god shrine, causing the commoners in the area to flee as if they had seen a ferocious beast. Qian Ping'an squatted down in front of the ruins of the main hall, retrieving 3 sticks of incense and placing them in the ground. He then smiled faintly and said, "I can't fulfill your wish and allow you to run away forever after closing your eyes. You still need to return to suffer together with me. The next time we meet, remember to treat me to some wine after you finish scolding me." Diyu didn't understand why the mighty senior was saying this. The deity of the fire god shrine was already as dead as could be, so could he possibly still come back to life? Even if the shrine were rebuilt, even if the local government crafted another clay statue for the fire god, and even if he weren't erased from the genealogical records of the Silver Screen Nation's imperial court, Just how much sincere worshipping and incense offerings would he require from the residents of Imperial Accompanying City to repair his godly body? The two of them left Imperial Accompanying City together. After traveling over mountains and across rivers for a few days, the mighty senior who hadn't worn his bamboo hat for many days retrieved his bamboo hat and hiking pole again. He was carrying a large and heavy bamboo case on his back, but he was still wearing a long and snow-white robe. Qian Ping handed Yu 2 pieces of paper and said, "One is called the Yang Energy Illumination Talisman, and one is called the Barrier Shattering Talisman. When traveling around the cultivation world in the future, it's up to you whether you do good deeds or do bad deeds. However, if you come across some matters where you have the choice to interfere or not interfere, for example, if you have the chance to become a righteous and chivalrous wanderer, or if you have the opportunity to vanquish demons for the sake of the people, these are the only times when you're allowed to use these 2 talismans. Otherwise, don't be greedy and try to use these talismans for other purposes. You should treat them as 2 pieces of useless paper during other times. Can you do this? Think about it carefully before you choose to accept or decline this offer. If you accept, then remember to destroy these 2 pieces of paper after you finish reading over them. If you decline, then that doesn't matter either, and you can feel free to leave." Yu didn't hesitate at all as he accepted the 2 pieces of paper, replying, "Rest assured, Senior. Just like Senior said before, it's up to me to decide my own life and fortune. After accepting these 2 pieces of paper today, and mastering the immortal talismans that Senior has bestowed upon me, I'll definitely render assistance if I have the energy to do so. Of course, this is unless I face a situation of certain death." Qian Ping smiled and patted Yu's shoulder, saying, "That's quite good." Yu unexpectedly felt tears of emotion welling up in his eyes. He looked at the mighty senior slowly disappearing into the distance. "Since Senior is a sword immortal, why don't you fly away on your sword?" he suddenly asked. Qian Ping simply adjusted his bamboo hat and waved his hand as he continued to walk forward. The Locust Flower Nation was a small and barren nation in the north, and everyone in the imperial court from the top to the bottom was poor. In fact, they were so poor that the emperor couldn't even dispatch officials to worship and give offerings to the mountain gods of the 5 mountains on time. Because of this, there eventually arose the saying that officials from the Ministry of Rights and the Ministry of Revenue didn't enter the mountains. Perhaps due to the imperial court showing a lack of respect for the 5 mountains, with this problem being exacerbated by the lack of temples and shrines and worshippers in the regions, there were often demons and fiends causing trouble in the mortal cities and towns of the Locust Flower Nation. This led to many spiritual masters and eminent monks from different nations traveling around the Locust Flower Nation to rescue its citizens from catastrophe and hardship. However, these capable individuals who were especially popular in the regions never entered the residences of true nobles and officials in the nation. In the end, they decided to directly avoid the capital of the nation altogether, lest they be treated poorly and given the cold shoulder. On this day, a scholar in white and wearing a bamboo hat handed over his passport and entered the city located on the border of the Locust Flower Nation and the Silver Screen Nation. After wandering around the city for a while, he sat down on his bamboo case on a bridge located near a market, munching down on a spring onion pancake that he had purchased just then. Along with the local residents and some traveling merchants engaging in small business, he listened to a storyteller recount tales about weird and fantastical matters. The storyteller was quite old, appearing to be in his 70s, but he was unexpectedly filled with energy and vigor, with his voice booming as his spittle flew everywhere. He said that an incredibly vicious great demon had appeared at Ornate Headpiece Prefecture a while ago, staying at the mountain top and transforming into a cloud of black smoke that snuck into the prefectural city whenever night fell. This great demon especially targeted young maidens, and the local government was completely powerless to stop it. In the end, the prefectural overseer recruited the help of an elderly spiritual master, with the latter setting up an altar and performing a ritual to summon thunder and lightning. The night sky was initially clear, with the moon bright and the stars twinkling, yet there was suddenly booming thunder and a torrential downpour. With a loud crack, a bolt of lightning directly crashed into the lair of the great demon, which was located in a mountain full of miasma. Afterward, a brave woodsman entered the mountain and navigated to the area of commotion, and he saw a large snake as thick as a well that had been brutally smashed to death by the ferocious bolt of lightning. However, it was a shame that none of the unfortunate young maidens could be saved, with skeletons littered around the mountain pass. The audience gasped upon hearing this, with a cold chill running down their spines as their hairs stood on end. The traveling scholar wearing a snow-white robe also gasped in astonishment like everyone else. There was the clinking sound of money as a member of the audience stepped forward to tip the storyteller, after which a number of other listeners also walked forward to toss some copper coins in the large white bowl. The elderly storyteller stroked his beard and smiled as he glanced at the copper coins in his bowl. This was enough to buy 2 pots of wine. Afterward, the elderly storyteller claimed that there were also demons and fiends causing trouble at Ritual Baton Prefecture, acting impudently as they wreaked havoc in the area. However, it was a shame that the prefectural overseer was a miserly person, having no networks and relationships and not willing to spend good money to recruit the help of a spiritual master or esteemed immortal to vanquish the demons either. As a result, the pitiful residents of Ritual Baton Prefecture could only suffer the fate of being relentlessly disturbed by the demons. Thankfully, these demons didn't possess high cultivation bases even though they were wanton and unrestrained. They were far weaker than the snake demon that had been killed by lightning atop the mountain at Ornate Headpiece Prefecture, or else a truly great tragedy would have taken place at Ritual Baton Prefecture. The residents of this border city enjoyed the lively atmosphere, so a man in the audience asked about the origin and background of the demons causing trouble in Ritual Baton Prefecture. The storyteller started to talk tirelessly about the culprits, saying that the white-clothed ghosts of people who had died by hanging liked to frighten the night watchmen of the region and bang on the doors of people at night. This resulted in people not daring to leave their houses and walk around the prefectural city at night. In addition to this, there were also foxes and rabbits that appeared near the abandoned tombs, transforming into shapely and seductive women, who liked to entice men and absorb their essence. There was yet another group of violent malicious ghosts that had occupied a temple and shooed away the monks, and there was also a young girl in green who resided in a section of the river near the dock and often summoned strong winds and large waves. Someone started to question the storyteller, saying that the Silver Screen Nation and the Locust Flower Nation had always enjoyed peace and stability, with no demon or fiend having caused trouble for the past several hundred years. Taking this into account, how could so many demons and fiends have suddenly appeared in the area? Perhaps someone who was bored and with nothing better to do was purposely causing trouble to scam people out of their money? The storyteller was indignant upon being questioned, and he claimed that he had personally seen the corpse of the snake demon at Ornate Headpiece Prefecture, as well as the deathly pale appearance of the young water ghost who lived near the dock. The audience laughed in ridicule, not believing the elderly storyteller's words. The elderly storyteller looked around, and his gaze eventually landed on a scholar in white who had just finished eating the spring onion pancake in his hand. He pointed at the young man and said, "This traveling scholar from an outside region has definitely read many books and experienced many things, so why don't you ask him whether ghosts and spirits truly exist in the world? Scholar, even if you haven't personally seen them before, it still counts even if you've heard of them before." Everyone looked toward the young scholar wearing a bamboo hat in unison, but the young man shook his head and replied, "I've never seen them before, and I've never heard of them before either." Boos immediately rang out from the audience. Seeing the situation take a turn for the worse, the elderly storyteller hurriedly retrieved his large white bowl and packed up his belongings for the day. Fucking hell, these scholars were all pathetic and ill-intentioned bastards. So be it if they didn't tip any copper coins, and it would be fine if they just stood around and acted as a good audience member. This person clearly had no chance of becoming a champion scholar. The audience naturally dispersed when they saw the elderly storyteller packing up and preparing to leave. The elderly storyteller shot an angry glare at the traveling scholar. Chun Ping smiled and stood up, putting the bamboo case on his back. He had already placed Sword Immortal, his sword Nurturing Gourd, and his jade bamboo fan in the bamboo case beforehand, so there was only the verdant green hiking pole remaining in his hand right now. Chun Ping had already finished refining this hiking pole during his travels. At the same time, there were several ordinary yellow paper talismans hidden inside his sleeve, with all of them being ordinary Yang Energy Illumination talismans, cleansing talismans and barrier-shattering talismans from the authentic death-avoiding book. Chun Ping walked over to the elderly storyteller and said, "Old mister, let me treat you to some wine. What do you say?" The elderly storyteller shot a sideways glance at Chen Ping'an, thinking that he looked feeble and didn't appear like a criminal who could rob someone blind. However, it wasn't easy to travel around the cultivation world, and who knew whether a shallow-looking puddle could cause one to trip and fall. Thus, even though the elderly scholar was very tempted, he still forcefully gulped and turned down the offer with a smile, saying, "There's no need. Thank you for your goodwill, young master, but I still need to make haste and travel to the Silver Screen Nation to make ends meet. The inns in this city charge exorbitantly high prices and treat guests as if they're animals to slaughter, but living on the streets will also invite unnecessary trouble. That being the case, I might as well cross the border to sleep in the wilderness of the Silver Screen Nation where neither heaven nor earth will care about me." "All right, then I won't keep old Mr. any longer," Chen Ping'an said in pity. "I'll just pretend that I've saved some money on a pot of Green Mountain Restaurant's fly whisk wine." The elderly storyteller's eyes lit up, and the wine bugs in his stomach immediately started to cause trouble. His expression immediately changed as he glanced up at the sky and said with a laugh, "Looking at the time, it's still early, and there's no rush for me to get anywhere. Brother Kongfeng and the others at the Silver Screen Nation can wait for a while longer, and I'll gladly accept young master's kind invitation. Come on, let's make our way to Green Mountain Restaurant. I've never tasted fly whisk wine before, but thanks to young master's generosity, I'll finally be able to enjoy a pot." "Old mister, you're not going to call your disciple over?" Chen Ping'an nodded and asked with a smile. The elderly storyteller was slightly embarrassed as he turned around and waved a hand, gesturing for the person who had stepped forward and tipped first just then to come over to his side. "Young master is quite astute," he said in a low voice. After arriving at the largest restaurant in the city, the three people sat down at a table on the second floor after following the guidance of a waiter. Chen Ping'an ordered a table of food and 3 pots of fly whisk wine, and only when the wine was brought to the table did the elderly storyteller silently grab his disciple's pot of fly whisk wine and put it in front of himself, saying with a faint smile, "I forgot to tell young master just then, but my disciple doesn't drink wine. I'm sorry that young master spent more money than necessary." A look of realization appeared on Chen Ping'an's face and he replied, "Then let me ask the waiter to take away the extra pot of fly whisk wine. It costs 2 taels of silver after all." The elderly storyteller hurriedly placed his arms around the 2 pots of wine, saying, "Please don't do that, young master. How can wine be taken away after it's been served? Isn't this the same as asking a beauty to undress and lie down in bed before telling her to piss off? This is completely unacceptable." Chen Ping'an cracked open the clay seal on his pot of wine, pouring himself a bowl and asking with a smile, "Old mister, you're not from the blissful dream nation, are you?" The elderly storyteller shook his head and replied, "I come from the westernmost Azure Essence Nation, and I have been working as a storyteller ever since I was 26 years old. I've traveled to more than half of the dozen or so nations, and I've also traveled to the blissful dream nation once. It's a rare paradise in the world, and I'm thinking about settling down in the blissful dream nation after I retire. I have no family and no attachments in my hometown anymore, so it doesn't matter if I relocate to another nation. If my disciple is capable and able to earn enough gold and silver, then I can indeed be buried back at my hometown after I close my eyes for the final time. Then please feel free to drink to your heart's content," Chen Ping'an said with a smile. Chen Ping'an could only tell that the elderly storyteller in front of him was a 3rd-tier qi refiner, but this implied 2 possibilities. Either the old man was genuinely a cultivator at the lower 5 tiers traveling around the nations, or he was a lofty cultivator whose cultivation base far exceeded that of Yi Han and Fan Weiran, 2 papier-mâché golden core tier cultivators. Apart from the 2 masterminds hiding behind the scenes, Yi Han and Fan Weiran could already be regarded as cultivators from the so-called pinnacle of the mountains. A few days ago, spiritual energy had rippled continuously at the borders of the dozen or so nations, appearing like spring thunder and catching the attention of Chen Ping'an. He had immediately stepped on his sword and flown into the sky, only to see an extremely long golden thread suddenly appear from the earth before burning to ashes. By the looks of it, one of the 2 powerful cultivators had retracted the mystical restriction ability that had been caging the dozen or so nations, and Chen Ping'an surmised that it was most likely the cultivator from the blissful dream nation who had obtained the valuable treasure from Imperial accompanying city. As for the other powerful cultivator called Xiaozhan, whom Qian Pingan temporarily knew nothing about, he had still yet to appear and cause trouble for Qian Pingan. Theoretically speaking, this was very unusual, especially since Fan Weiron's treasure base in Immortal Realm and Yihan's Yellow Axe City, as well as all of their subordinate immortal forces, were very likely underlings raised by Xiazhen. Taking this into account, there were only two possible reasons why he hadn't made a move yet. The first reason was that a lion needed to go all out even when hunting a rabbit, so Xiazhen was potentially waiting for him at some undisclosed location right now. Alternatively, Zhang Shangzhen had already dealt with the mess after appearing at Imperial Accompanying City, either killing Xiazhen or allowing him to luckily escape with his life but be too severely wounded to target and kill Qian Pingan. If the elderly storyteller in front of him was truly the powerful cultivator from the blissful Dream Nation and had especially come here to meet him, then Qian Pingan couldn't be bothered speaking in riddles with him and playing mind games. He would prefer to roll up his sleeves and engage in battle. The elderly storyteller smiled and said, "Why does young master ask? Does young master have an acquaintance in the blissful Dream Nation? Or perhaps it's a mortal enemy or a dear friend? If it's the latter, then I can help young master pass on a message after I complete my travels around the Silver Screen Nation and go to the blissful Dream Nation with my foolish disciple." However, the old man raised two fingers and grinned as he rubbed them together. Qian Pingan shook his head and replied, "There's no strong feeling of hostility, and neither of us interferes with the other. I simply admire the lofty abilities of a powerful individual from the blissful Dream Nation, as well as his meticulous manner of doing things. I hope to sincerely treat him to a pot of wine. Everything is settled already, but there are still some small and regrettable matters." This powerful individual was very forceful and domineering at the start of the chess game, very calm and steady in the middle of the game, and left many wonderful formations at the end of the game. However, there was surprisingly no one to acknowledge this and cheer for him. This would be analogous to everyone falling silent after old Mr. finished telling his stories just then. Even if old Mr. obtained a bowl full of copper coins, the silence at the end would still be disappointing and regrettable. "No." The elderly storyteller took a sip of wine and said, "Even though I don't really understand what young master is saying, this does indeed sound quite reasonable. So how about a toast?" Qian Pingan raised his wine bowl and touched it with the elderly storytellers, after which they both started to drink by themselves. Drinking fine wine with like-minded people added to the enjoyment. However, drinking with mortal enemies, with deadly schemes hiding in the shadows and killing intent lurking in the wine bowls, was also a form of cultivation. Regarding the new phenomenon that was appearing at the Locust Flower Nation, a small nation in the northern regions, the sudden increase in demons and fiends was related to the flood of spiritual energy surging into the territories of the dozen or so nations. Without the presence of the thunder pool to intimidate all matter, these demons and fiends naturally became livelier like the snakes and insects after spring thunder. Right now, Qian Pingan had no plans to engage in conflict with Xiazhen, or the powerful cultivator from the blissful Dream Nation. When it came to cultivators above the Golden Core tier, those at the nascent tier were still manageable, as he could flee even if he wasn't able to defeat them. However, if even one of them were an unpolished Jade tier cultivator, then that would spell huge trouble for Qian Pingan, especially since he didn't have any advantage here, neither timing nor geographic nor personnel. If the two powerful cultivators truly wanted to kill him at all costs, then with the temper of cultivators at the northern complete reed continent, they definitely wouldn't hesitate in the least. Indeed, many outsider cultivators with powerful backers had been killed in this continent where the sword immortals were extremely xenophobic toward outsiders. Otherwise, if Qian Pingan were more ruthless, he could directly use his jade tablet of a sage to absorb the spiritual energy that was flooding into the dozen or so nations like a receding tide. However, activating this jade tablet, one that even Bamboo Scroll Lake's Lu Laoqing felt apprehensive of, from another continent like the northern complete reed continent would be a completely different situation. This was a huge taboo, and he would perhaps earn the contempt and interrogation of the continent's Confucian Academy. Of the two powerful masterminds, Qian Pingan was more afraid of the cultivator who had ties with the blissful Dream Nation than Xiazhen, and this was because he had planned everything out meticulously and hadn't needed to get involved in the conflict himself. He had simply dispatched two underlings to obtain the valuable treasure from Imperial Accompanying City. If it hadn't been for Chan Ping breaking through the formations and barging into the Dragon Palace at the bottom of verdant bamboo lake, the Vajrabhati tier martial artist who had been disguising himself as a weakling among the chi refiners from Blissful Dream Peak would have definitely continued to conceal his identity. Coming across Yu was enough to roughly understand the situation at Ghost Axe Palace, and coming across the canal masters of Peony Stream and Algae Stream had been enough to roughly understand the traditions and customs of verdant bamboo lake. Similarly, seeing Yanqing was enough to roughly understand the actions of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, and seeing He Lu was enough to roughly understand the actions of Yellow Axe City. There would naturally be some slight differences between Chan Ping's rough understanding and the truth, but the longer that he interacted with these immortal forces and the more of their disciples that he came across, the closer to the truth he would eventually get. At that time, it would also become less and less likely for Chan Ping to be taken by surprise. Of course, there were also times when seeing one person was enough to understand an entire immortal force, and this was because the city god of Imperial Accompanying City, Fan Weiran, and Yi Han were all the leaders of their respective temples and immortal forces. They were the ones dictating the traditions and values of their forces. One method was looking up and one method was looking down, and after grabbing both ends, it would be like grabbing the two ends of a string. At that time, it would be difficult for the string to escape observation even if it lay hidden for hundreds upon thousands of kilometers. The world was a complicated place. If one wanted to live a carefree life, then one option was to remain naive and only focus on one's own matters, accepting all of the fortunes and hardships that came one's way. The other option was to look more and to think more, with this option being much more mentally and physically taxing. There was always a taller mountain, and always a more powerful person. Even the sages who oversaw the various small worlds and were akin to the heavens of these worlds would feel restricted and stifled when they left these small worlds. They would be at the mercy of other people, and they would also need to observe the many interconnected matters and complicated rules of the world. Speaking reason wouldn't necessarily be effective. However, understanding the rules definitely wouldn't be a bad thing. Did Lake Lord Inho speak reason? Perhaps not. However, he understood how to uncover the rules of other people, figuring out the manner in which Chan Ping dealt with matters. As such, Chan Ping wouldn't dare to kill him if black clouds enveloped the area above verdant bamboo lake, afraid that the innocent people in the region would be affected if the one lake, 3 rivers, and 2 canals unleashed floods. Among the people standing in the Dragon Palace at the time, Lake Lord Inho had been no less deserving of death than Yi Han and Fan Weiran. However, he had voluntarily promised to protect the lives of those in his jurisdiction, and he had offered to repair the fortunes of the mountains and rivers to repent for his crimes. It was thanks to this that Chan Ping's fists and swords hadn't targeted Lake Lord Inho. Afterward, the elderly storyteller and his disciple wolfed down the food, eating to their heart's content. Chan Ping slowly drank the wine in his bowl, not picking up his chopsticks to eat any of the food. The elderly storyteller burped and asked with a chuckle, "Young master, you're only drinking and not eating anything at all. Are you not feeling hungry?" Chan Ping smiled and replied, "That's right, I'm not feeling hungry right now. In any case, I feel like old Mr. deserves to enjoy this full meal." "Young master, why are your words like those bald donkeys speaking about sin? It's making me scratch my head in confusion." The elderly storyteller replied in exasperation. "When is old Mr. crossing the border to enter the Silver Screen Nation?" Chan Ping asked. The elderly storyteller smiled and replied, "I'm going to set off right away since I've already eaten and drunk my fill. I learned some anthroposcopy in the past, so since young master has treated me to a meal, how about I tell young master's fortune? Rest assured, I won't charge young master for this." "Then I'll trouble old mister with telling my fortune," Chan Ping said with a nod. The elderly storyteller retrieved several of the copper coins that he had obtained just then, casually tossing them onto the table before stroking his beard in contemplation. He fell completely silent. Chan Ping smiled and didn't say anything. The elderly storyteller pushed the copper coins around with his finger and said with a frown, "Young master is a kind-hearted person with rich fortune, but young master must keep in mind that people with fortune shouldn't visit lands without fortune. These old sayings aren't baseless, so don't disregard them just because they sound crude." Looking at young master's northward journey to the Locust Flower Nation, young master can visit any place apart from Top Knot Mountain that's located 50 or so kilometers ahead. This is a land with no fortune for young master, so it's best to avoid visiting it. Visiting Top Knot Mountain might not necessarily be very dangerous, but it will ultimately be troublesome if young master truly comes across sinister fiends blocking the path. Alright, then I'll heed old Mister's advice and take a detour around Top Knot Mountain, Qian Pingyan replied with a smile. Young master truly believes me? The elderly storyteller looked up and asked with a smile. How can I not believe an elder's words? Qian Pingyan replied with a chuckle. In any case, it's not a big deal to take a small detour and walk a few extra steps when traveling to the Locust Flower Nation. The elderly storyteller stood up and said with an expression of praise, Then I won't disturb young master any longer. I'll take my leave first and cross the border as quickly as I can. After all, telling someone's fortune and revealing divine secrets always makes me feel uneasy. Qian Pingyan nodded and said, I'll also take a detour and travel north after I finish this pot of wine. I'll avoid Top Knot Mountain and refrain from causing myself unnecessary trouble. The elderly storyteller left Green Mountain Restaurant with his expressionless disciple. After finishing the pot of fly whisk wine, a local specialty, and going downstairs to pay, Qian Pingyan couldn't help but falter for a moment before shaking his head with a smile. The wine and food set him back a whopping 20 taels of silver, and as it turned out, the elderly storyteller had secretly asked for 2 pots of Green Mountain Restaurant's most valuable 20-year-old wine before leaving, saying that his friend upstairs was going to pay. Qian Pingyan didn't pay too much heed to this, especially since there was no need to speculate about the elderly storyteller's true identity anymore. This was one less matter to worry about, and he no longer needed to split his attention and detrimentally affect his cultivation. In this sense, spending an extra dozen or so taels of silver was a very good deal. In the end, Qian Pingyan genuinely took a detour around Top Knot Mountain as he traveled north to the Locust Flower Nation. There were many cascading waterfalls in Top Knot Mountain, and this had initially been a scenic area that Qian Pingyan had wanted to visit. Someplace in Top Knot Mountain, inside a resting pavilion at the waist of the mountain, a young man with an azure belt stood there with a livid expression, and standing beside him were Yi Han, Fan Weiran, and the second ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm. The young man was none other than Xia Zhen, who had luckily escaped death after being targeted by Jiang Shangzhen. Old geezer, why did you ruin my grand plans? Xia Zhen roared in rage. I already told you very clearly that I've already sent a letter to that great sword immortal in the central region. This sword cultivator is an accomplice of Jiang Shangzhen's, so even if Jiang Shangzhen is hiding in the shadows, he'll still be feeling very apprehensive and timid. But you've gone ahead and scared away the bait now, so what will you do when the great sword immortal becomes enraged? Are you truly acting like you've already refined the innate sword pellet and advanced to the upper 5 tiers? Are you stupid? I've already made a vow that the pseudo-celestial tool will belong to you after we succeed, and I'll only take the remaining items in his possession, yet you're still not satisfied with this. Will you only be satisfied if we both come away with nothing? On a mountain in the distance, an elder in Confucian robes smiled faintly as an elderly storyteller and an expressionless young man appeared beside him. In the end, the 3 of them overlapped and became a single person. He had most likely been using an immortal technique whereby both his yang soul and his yin soul were able to leave his body and travel elsewhere. The elder smiled and replied, Don't try to frighten me using empty threats. With that great sword immortal's temperament, they'll find it beneath themselves to become involved in these matters even if they receive your secret letter. And using bait to fish? Do you truly think that our small conflicts in these dozen or so nations require so much effort? The elder was none other than the imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation. He retrieved a messenger flying sword with 2 fingers and lightly crushed it into pieces, continuing, In any case, the great sword immortal hasn't received your secret letter to begin with. Xia Zhan's expression was dark, and he suddenly laughed in extreme anger and bellowed, Are you planning to become mortal enemies with me? The elderly imperial preceptor smiled faintly and replied, The spiritual energy in the territory of the dozen or so nations has increased by quite a bit now, making this region one that is neither good nor bad. You and I have been neighbors for many years, and you're renowned for being incredibly difficult to deal with. Even though the foundations of your great Tao have been wounded now, I'm still unable to kill you, and you're even less able to kill me. Right now, the two of us are competing to see who can advance to the upper 5 tiers first. So how can I sit here idly and allow you to send a secret letter to the residents of that great sword immortal in the central region? What if that great sword immortal truly resents Jiang Shangzhen so much that they're willing to degrade themselves and target a small sword cultivator? At that time you'll be able to earn their goodwill and ride on their coattails, so how can I compete with you for these dozen or so nations even if I advance to the unpolished jade tier in the future? Ah, what a pity, Xiazhen. Even though you're furious and flustered and have slowed down your speed of voraciously absorbing the spiritual energy of the border regions, you'll still need to waste 20 entire days at Top Knot Mountain with your 3 lackeys. Moreover, it seems like the mountain-moving formation that you've painstakingly set up is going to end up unused. Aren't you still here? Xiazhen replied with a cold smile. The imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation feigned realization and remarked, "You're right. However, between my preliminarily refined sword pellet and your mountain-moving formation, I wonder which one is more powerful and possesses more destructive ability. There will eventually be a battle between you and me, so bringing this battle forward will indeed save some trouble. Now is different from before, and it's no longer the case that you're stronger than me. The tides of fortune turn, so don't tell me that you don't actually understand the current situation." Xiazhen. He then smiled and shook his head, continuing, "In any case, I'm not looking down on you, Xiazhen, but your formation might not necessarily be enough to trap Jiang Shangzhen even though it can indeed injure him. I'm helping you step back from the brink of a terrible mistake right now, so you shouldn't treat my good intentions as ill will instead. You actually dare to challenge Jiang Shangzhen to a conflict of life and death after sending out a secret letter that may well receive no response? In order to prevent you from picking up any clues about me, I have indeed suffered from a paucity of news over the past several hundred years. However, even though my intel is inferior to yours, I know more about some historical matters than you do. As such, I wouldn't have blocked your messenger flying sword if you had sent the secret letter to the great sword immortal in the north." The imperial preceptor suppressed a smile and looked at Xiazhen, with pity and ridicule in his eyes as he revealed, "That's because the sword immortal in the north is a man. His darling daughter was harmed by Jiang Shangzhen back then, with her pursuit of the great Tao delayed because of her relationship with him. As such, this great sword immortal would have naturally unleashed his full strength to kill Jiang Shangzhen. However, the great sword immortal whom you sent your secret letter to is a woman. It's clear that you're not aware of this, but after her relationship with Jiang Shangzhen back then, what she feels angry about isn't born from a feeling of regret about becoming attracted to Jiang Shangzhen like the rumors in the outside world claim. Rather, she's angry about Jiang Shangzhen having relationships with other women and having affairs wherever he goes. After she comes here and is fed some entrancing nonsense by Jiang Shangzhen, are you not afraid that she'll turn around and reward us with a sword strike each? Which is to say, Xiazhen, you truly aren't a very reliable ally. If that young sword cultivator possessed a higher cultivation base, being at the nascent tier like the two of us, then I might have joined forces with him to kill you and conclude our competition. Now, however, saying anything more is pointless since things have already come to this. I won't fight to the death with you either, since that will be a waste of my cultivation. You can slowly absorb spiritual energy to rest and recuperate. Falling behind one step implies remaining behind the entire time, and according to my divinations from many years ago, you would initially have reached the barrier of the nascent tier 60 years later than me under the original circumstances already. Judging from the current situation, your Tao heart is actually still unstable even at this moment. After reaching our level, cultivators will suffer greatly if they still conduct themselves as if they're vagrant cultivators who can always exploit matters for their own benefit. The resting pavilion that Xiazhen was standing in instantly disintegrated into dust, forcing Yi Han, Fan Weiran, and the second ancestor of the treasure basin immortal realm to fly out and hover in midair with frightened and flustered expressions. The imperial preceptor paid no heed to this as he continued, "You and I formed a temporary alliance after all, and even though I indeed had ulterior motives when concealing my identity at the blissful dream nation, cultivating and training in the mortal realm was genuinely beneficial to my Tao heart. It's because of this that I'm able to suppress you in all facets and obtain more treasures than you all the time. Did you truly think that all of this was simply as a result of my plots and schemes? Nay, it's because I've taken that step before you and grasped a wisp of the nascent tier's Tao integration essence. If Jiang Shangzhen is truly good friends with that young sword cultivator, then would he purposely leave behind a future threat like you? He's simply able to see further than you and me, and he was already able to foresee the events of today. Are you not afraid? Because I am. This was an overt scheme to me, and I was willing to partake in it to ruin your grand schemes. I became involved for the sake of establishing my own immortal force in the future, and for the sake of having my immortal force take root in the dozen or so nations. However, this was naturally a hidden scheme for you, Xiaozhan, and this hidden scheme caused you to hit roadblocks and come away empty-handed again and again. In fact, I even speculate that Jiang Shangzhen purposely enabled me to capture this messenger flying sword of yours. Xiaozhan retracted his overwhelming aura and said with a faint smile, "You've ruined my grand plans, and now you're even trying to unsettle my mental state. This is a brilliant plan, you old criminal." The Imperial Preceptor sighed with emotion and said, "True or false, good or bad, regardless of my original intentions and the legitimacy of my sincerity, I won't go out of my way to block you from absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth according to our agreement from before. However, I've already walked one step, no 2 steps ahead of you, Xiaozhan. So, I'll give you another choice when I advance to the upper 5 tiers in the future. Will you flee from this area and continue to live as a wandering vagrant cultivator, or will you choose to become the chief guest elder of my immortal sect? If you choose the latter, then the two of us will no longer need to engage in unnecessary battles of the Great Tao for small regions such as this. If one immortal sect is able to have 2 unpolished jade-tier cultivators experiencing glory and hardships together, with both having risen to the top after starting as vagrant cultivators who are disdained by everyone, then will that not be a wonderful story that's told in the northern complete reed continent for countless generations?" Xiaozhan remained silent, simply looking up and gazing at the elder in Confucian robes who was standing at the pinnacle of a mountain in the distance. In the end he smiled and asked, "Have you always been this ambitious and greedy? Were you always planning to recruit me as the chief guest elder of your immortal force?" The Imperial Preceptor shook his head and replied, "Those below the upper 5 tiers, even the so-called terrestrial earth immortals, are still forced to follow the ebbs and flows of the world. It was only after obtaining the valuable treasure of virtue and cultivating my mental state to a level close to perfection that I developed such ambition and vision. This is also the reason why I didn't take advantage of the situation and attack you after you were wounded by Jiang Shangzhen. Otherwise, since I was able to intercept your flying sword, why did I still allow you to linger around Top Knot Mountain? Why didn't I risk some wounds to comprehensively dispose of you? After all, which vagrant cultivator wouldn't choose this option?" Xiaozhan placed his hands on the slumbering azure snake around his waist, pursing his lips as he asked, "Then have you ever considered the fact that I might have released more than one messenger flying sword? And that the messenger flying sword intercepted by you was only a decoy that I purposely allowed you to capture? Why don't you calculate this? From the time that Jiang Shangzhen left Imperial Accompanying City to return south to the time that I appeared at Top Knot Mountain, will the timing line up perfectly for Jiang Shangzhen and the Great Sword Immortal from the north to potentially appear here together?" The Imperial Preceptor sighed and said, "I've already told you everything, so it's up to you if you still want to take this gamble. In any case, you've already become consumed by your desire to gamble, so saying any more will be pointless." There was a twisted smile on Xiaozhan's face as he spat. "Yes, I'm already consumed by my desire to gamble, so if you continue to stand there and spout nonsense, then don't blame me for attacking you and delaying your refinement of the sword pellet even if it means suffering further injuries." The Imperial Preceptor waved his hand and said, "So be it. I'll simply pretend that I've lost an unpolished jade-tier guest elder for my future immortal force." Xiaozhan waved a sleeve and roared with a stern expression, "Fuck off, old bastard. Just looking at you pisses me off." The Imperial Preceptor dismissed this with a smile as his body faded away. Xiaozhan stood in the ruins of the resting pavilion, appearing like a caged beast as he walked in circles. He then waved his hands and caused a dozen or so mountains, including Top Knot Mountain, to rise into the air as if they had been severed from the earth. Xiaozhan used the mountain-moving formation to flip these mountains upside down, after which he released them and had them crash into the ground. Clouds of dust and debris blotted out heaven and earth as the inverted mountains collided into the nearby mountains and rivers, with the force of each collision being equivalent to a destructive power between the golden core tier and the nascent tier. However, it was a shame that the mountain-moving formation was an inanimate formation that couldn't be moved. That old bastard had alerted the detestable young sword immortal and scared him away, making him take a detour around Topknot Mountain as he traveled north. As a result, the mountain-moving formation that he had spent a fortune to set up had become nothing more than a decoration and a huge joke. That being the case, Xiaozhan was now wielding its formidable power to vent his uncontrollable fury. Everyone within a radius of 500 kilometers felt violent tremors ripple through the earth. Yi Han Fan Weiran, and the second ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm, immediately tensed up in apprehension upon seeing this. In the end, Xiaozhan even uprooted Topknot Mountain and severed its mountain roots, raising it high into the sea of clouds before slamming it back down. However, Xiaozhan suddenly furrowed his brows. 2 people, or 3 people to be more precise, walked over from the path along the mountain ridge. A man and a woman who looked like Dao partners walked over together, chatting and smiling as they did so. The woman was even carrying a swaddled baby in her arms, with a soft and gentle look in her eyes. There was an extremely slender and snow-white sword hanging by the woman's waist. Xiaozhan's mind was already starting to feel numb. As for the man, the sight of him further caused an ice-cold chill to run down Xiaozhan's spine. "Goodness me, this is disturbing Big Sister Li and my child," the man grumbled. "I'll have to make all kinds of funny faces to calm the child down now." Xiaozhan felt genuine despair at this moment. The woman whom the man was referring to as Big Sister Li, if his guess of her identity was correct, then he wouldn't be able to flee today even if he fought with his life on the line. The female sword immortal from the central region of the northern complete reed continent was called Li Kai. Her bonded flying sword was called Snowflake. The sword by her waist was called Frost Flood Dragon. She was one of the sword immortals who hadn't traveled to Stalactite Mountain and was still residing in the northern complete reed continent. In order to show respect toward her, she was now referred to as Great Sword Immortal, rather than just Sword Immortal. This sounded very forced. However, her destructive ability couldn't be questioned. All of the upper 5-tier sword immortals in the northern complete reed continent were legitimately very powerful, and even nascent tier sword cultivators would actually scoff at the thought of challenging unpolished jade tier cultivators. They would feel embarrassed even if they won. After a sword cultivator advanced to the unpolished jade tier, however, they would almost inevitably engage in several intense battles with other sword immortals. If they died in battle, this would mean that their fortune was bad, and that they had dared to impudently challenge others even though their abilities were limited. They didn't deserve to carry the title of Sword Immortal, and it was better that they were dead. If the newly advanced sword cultivator survived, however, then they would have the right to enjoy a lofty standing in the northern complete reed continent. Xiaozhan gritted his teeth and turned around to face the mountain path, bowing in respect and greeting. "My respects to Great Sword Immortal Li, and my respects to Senior Jiang." Jiang Shangzhen chuckled and remarked, "Oh? You know to refer to me as Senior now." Li Kai frowned and said, "If it weren't for your tactfulness, knowing to send me a messenger flying sword to notify me of the situation, then you would already be dead now. Do you understand etiquette at all, you vagrant cultivator? Change the order around." Xiaozhan's head was almost obliterated on the spot, so he hurriedly corrected in a quivering voice, "My respects to Senior Jiang, and my respects to Great Sword Immortal Li." Jiang Shangzhen patted Li Kai's shoulder and said, "Don't be like this, Big Sister Li. Are you not aware of what kind of person I am? I've never cared about these useless formalities." Li Kai humped coldly and replied, "I'll deal with you later. Keep in mind that I haven't agreed to travel to Bamboo Scroll Lake to help you show off yet." Jiang Shangzhen's expression was calm and relaxed as he bent down and lifted up one corner of the blankets, saying with a gentle smile, "Little girl, your newly found mommy is feeling angry now, so hurry up and grow up so you can put in some good words for daddy." Li Kai suppressed a smile. Meanwhile, Xiaozhan felt like he was about to go crazy. Jiang Shangzhen turned around to look at Xiaozhan, saying, "You're quite similar to me during my youth, being skilled at both fighting and fleeing. This is very impressive and commendable, and it's because of this that I spared your lowly life, thinking that you would quieten down after I met Big Sister Li and traveled south with her. In that case, I wouldn't have punished you any further. However, it's a shame that your ability to flee is half of what mine was back then. Yet your brain is nothing more than scrambled tofu. The imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation explained so many facts to you, and it was as if he were a father trying to sincerely guide his son. Yet how did you respond? You refused to listen to a single word of his. When I traveled around the northern complete reed continent back then, I came across many cultivators from the mountains who sought death with intent and vigor, and I kindly helped these cultivators fulfill their wishes. However, your manner of seeking death in all kinds of fresh and novel ways is truly quite a rare sight to behold. I earnestly ask Senior Jiang to give me one more chance. Just one last chance. Xiaozhen pleaded in a solemn voice. The great sword immortal from the north was indeed tempted by your secret letter to travel over here. Zhang Shangzhen chuckled. However, my wife and I worked together to fight against him, going to great efforts to finally push him back. A gigantic riverbed and a massive crater were created near the large river in the central region of the continent, and I surmise that a gigantic new lake has already been created now. This sounds very fun, don't you think? However, that great sword immortal was truly put in an awkward position, going as far as to suppress his nature and hide in the shadows in order to attack and kill me. Thankfully, Big Sister Li was familiar with his sword intent, or else I might have truly lost an arm or a leg at the northern complete reed continent. If the great sword immortal failed to do this, then he might as well have smacked himself to death with a block of tofu. The situation was truly very dire. Xiaozhen, you're truly someone who can't give things a rest. I'm scared of you, okay? Are you happy now? I'm begging you to spare me, Lord Xia, so can you please grant my wish? Xiaozhen didn't hesitate any longer. There was definitely no way to end this encounter peacefully. There was a loud pop. Hundreds upon thousands of Xiaozhans materialized from his true body, with some soaring into the sky, some sprinting across the land, and some burrowing into the ground as they fled. He could survive as long as one of these clones managed to flee. This was a secret technique that required a huge price and would significantly worsen his severe wounds, but it was definitely a better option than being completely annihilated by two upper 5-tier cultivators. Zhang Shangzhen feigned astonishment and exclaimed, "This wasn't how you fled last time." "Good one, as expected of someone who's an immortal in the eyes of these ants. You're scaring me to death." Great sword immortal Li Kai pursed her lips and placed her hand on the hilt of her sword, causing it to ring softly but not leave its scabbard. Countless streaks of snow-white sword chi surged over from all directions around Top Knot Mountain, with some rushing over directly, some undulating, and some hovering slowly. Heaven and earth fell silent at this moment. Zhang Shangzhen reached forward and grabbed a golden core as well as a grain-sized miniature person, placing them inside his sleeve before making another grabbing motion and retrieving the limp azure snake from the ground, also placing this inside his sleeve. He appeared very irritated as he lamented, "This is so bloody annoying. I've somehow obtained more treasures again." Li Kai shot a glare at him. Zhang Shangzhen softly called the newly given name of the swaddled baby girl a few times, saying with a faint smile, "So be it, this isn't a big problem. I'll just treat this as the future dowry for our baby girl." Li Kai felt slightly impatient as she looked at the three eyesores standing near the ruined resting pavilion, and she asked, "What should we do about these three ignorant weaklings?" Zhang Shangzhen shot a sideways glance at the three people. Yi Han and the others were already kneeling in midair. In their eyes, Xiaozhen was someone from the pinnacle of the mountains. Yet, he had been ruthlessly killed in the blink of an eye just like that? Zhang Shangzhen's movements were gentle as he helped Li Kai straighten her sleeve, and he replied, "How about we leave it at this? Our darling daughter is still here after all." As Zhang Shangzhen spoke, a willow leaf instantly pierced through the glabella of Yi Han and Fan Weiran before eventually returning to his body. He smiled and remarked, "Our daughter is sleeping anyway, so she won't be able to see any of this." The corpses of the two golden core tier cultivators plummeted to the foot of Top Knot Mountain. Zhang Shangzhen didn't spare so much as a single glance at them. Would it be worth it for Zhang Shangzhen to bend down to pick up their worthless treasures? Would this not delay his plans to make big money? Only the second ancestor of the Treasure Basin Immortal Realm remained, and the woman at the Dragon Gate tier trembled as she remained prostrated in midair. Zhang Shangzhen and Li Kai started to fly south. Li Kai wasn't surprised by Zhang Shangzhen's actions at all. She was already accustomed to this. If it weren't for the silver-tongued man beside her, Li Kai would have already died at the bottleneck of the Golden Core tier many years ago. Jiang Shangzhen had lost half his life that time. This was one of the very few losses that he had suffered during his journey around the northern complete reed continent back then. However, even until now, Li Kai was still unsure about why Jiang Shangzhen had saved her. His feelings for her at the time had naturally been genuine, and he had perhaps liked her a tad bit more than he had liked other beautiful women. However, this definitely wasn't a reason for him to risk his life for her. Li Kai had always wanted to find out the answer to this question, and she had even made a special trip to the Parasol Leaf continent for the sake of figuring out the answer. However, she had failed to meet Jiang Shangzhen that time, and old sect leader Sun Yuan of the Jade Tablet sect had informed her that Jiang Shangzhen had entered the Cloud Cave Blessed Land and was temporarily not going to return. In fact, Sun Yuan had even helped her scold Jiang Shangzhen, saying that disloyal bastards like him deserved to die in the Cloud Cave Blessed Land, and that Lady Li would be dirtying her eyes by taking so much as a single glance at him. It served Jiang Shangzhen right that his blessed land had become a chaotic mess, causing him to nearly die inside. However, Li Kai was aware that old sect leader Sun Yuan had still been on Jiang Shangzhen's side, having mentioned a lot of things pertaining to her and Jiang Shangzhen in a roundabout manner. It was clear that he hoped Li Kai wouldn't lose hope and give up on him. Now that Li Kai had truly reunited with Jiang Shangzhen, however, the woman who was already a great sword immortal in the central region of the northern complete reed continent no longer wanted to know the answer. Li Kai glanced back and asked, "You're not going to say anything to him?" Jiang Shangzhen shook his head and replied, "The connection between him and He Xiaoyang is far too strong, and you're also by my side right now. I'm an outsider, so I'm not afraid of these troubles. However, you're from this continent, so I can't make things difficult for you for no good reason." Li Kai smiled faintly upon hearing this. She suddenly frowned the next moment and asked, looking at the aftershocks rippling through the sea of black clouds before, even a weaker nascent tier cultivator would have struggled immensely against the heavenly tribulation descending upon Imperial accompanying city, so how did he manage to block it? Jiang Shangzhen smiled and replied, "How else? He simply fought with his life on the line. Sincerity is the key to success. And this is a saying that should be believed from time to time. The plans of mortals and gods fall before the plans of the heavens, just as the principles of earth are inferior to the principles of heaven. The cultivator, pretending to be the imperial preceptor of the blissful dream nation, has captured a sliver of this principle. However, it's extremely rare and difficult for nascent tier cultivators to observe these heavenly principles, so he naturally possessed more future potential than Xia Zhan." Li Kai nodded in strong agreement. "I heard that you recruited an outstanding female disciple?" Jiang Shangzhen suddenly asked. "And she now has a chance to become one of the top 10 prodigies of the continent?" There was a strange expression on Li Kai's face. Jiang Shangzhen rolled his eyes and scoffed. "Why are you feeling worried about me? Even rabbits don't feed on the grass beside their nests, and I only ever like a single person from each immortal force. This is the essence of my principles. To travel through the mountains as quickly as a gust of wind, and to remain stable and ever standing like upright pine. Then why are you asking about this?" Li Kai quizzed with a frosty expression. Jiang Shangzhen smiled and replied, "I'm just worried that she'll follow in your footsteps and fall for the same outstanding man as her master." Li Kai shook her head and said, "The staunchness of her Tao heart is even greater than the staunchness of my Tao heart back then. She won't fall for anyone in her lifetime. It's often said that good women can be overwhelmed by persistent men, but this saying won't hold true for my disciple." Jiang Shangzhen laughed heartily and explained, "No, you're wrong. I'm afraid that she'll be the one who's persistent and clinging to my brother Howren." Li Kai snickered upon hearing this. Jiang Shangzhen grinned and proposed, "Then how about we make a bet, Big Sister Li? If I lose, then I'll do whatever you ask. If Big Sister Li loses, then you'll agree to become a guest elder in my new sect at Bamboo Scroll Lake. Deal?" Li Kai said with a nod. There was a strange expression on Jiang Shangzhen's face as he asked, "Why did Big Sister Li agree so readily? Didn't Big Sister Li personally experience my insane gambling skills and gambling luck back then?" Li Kai smiled faintly and replied, "My disciple needs to cultivate in seclusion for 30 years, so can that young man wander around the northern complete reed continent for 30 years? Jiang Shangzhen reached over and grabbed Li Kai's sleeve, pleading, "My good sister, can you please spare me this time? Can't you settle on liking a single person?" Li Kai asked with a dejected expression. We can discuss this when Big Sister Li is one cultivation base higher than me, Zhang Shangzhen replied with a faint smile. Li Kai sighed and used the sword in her heart to sever the minor ripples in her mind. Afterward, she traveled to Skeleton Shoal with Zhang Shangzhen, where they boarded the intercontinental ship of the Flax Robe sect to travel to the eastern treasured Vile continent. The bastard beside her was apparently traveling to a place called Downtrodden Mountain in the Greatly Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture, disguising himself as a nascent tier cultivator called Zhou Fei and asking for a position as a guest elder. Judging by Zhang Shangzhen's tone, it was no certainty that he would succeed. Li Kai turned her head and glanced at the contemplating Zhang Shangzhen. He had a punchable expression when he smiled and spoke. However, he appeared extremely earnest and serious when he wasn't smiling. It was a shame that the only woman whom Zhang Shangzhen couldn't get over was surprisingly an ordinary mortal woman from outside the mountains. Moreover, he never had an affair with this woman, and he simply watched from a distance as she got married, lost her beauty, grew old, and eventually died a peaceful death. Li Kai hesitated for a moment before asking, Zhang Shangzhen, would you still like that woman as much as you did before if you came across her today? Naturally not, Zhang Shangzhen replied with a shake of his head. Li Kai appeared slightly puzzled. When seeing things for the first time, the young women in the outside world appear charming. The scenery from the mountaintops appears magnificent. Looking up there are immortals soaring on clouds, and flying through the sky there are the radiant sun and moon, Zhang Shangzhen said slowly. The feeling of seeing these things for the first time is completely different from the feeling of seeing these things many times afterward. It's not necessarily the case that the people or the matters are particularly attractive or magnificent the first time we see them, but the feelings that they evoke linger in my heart and remain unforgettable even after hundreds upon thousands of years. Zhang Shangzhen smiled and turned around, continuing. This is just like the first time I met Big Sister Li, when you were walking up the stairs in socks. Shut your mouth, Li Kai exclaimed in embarrassment and anger. Don't be embarrassed, wife, you're making your husband feel worried, Zhang Shangzhen said in a gentle voice. And the Locust Flower Nation's ritual Baton Prefecture. There were many notices put up by the local government and wealthy clans near the city gates of the prefectural city, with all of them recruiting lofty beings to their residences to perform rituals. The bottom of these notices often promised extremely good compensation, but they all refrained from mentioning how many taels of silver this actually translated to. Chen Ping'an stood in front of the wall and carefully read over the notices, and by the looks of it, things were quite chaotic both inside and outside the prefectural city. After purchasing some dry rations and other goods in the prefectural city, Chen Ping'an found an inn to stay at for the night. When darkness set in, he sat on the roof ridge and quietly drank wine. Sure enough, a snow-white figure flew around the city streets when it was late at night, with her expression twisted and her tongue sticking out. She hovered around with her feet above the ground, but her murderous aura was thin and she avoided the residences with door gods plastered on their front doors, regardless of whether these door gods still possessed spiritual energy or not. The night watchman in the prefectural city had been replaced by two bold young men with flourishing yang energy, and the local government especially rewarded them with extra compensation so that they could purchase 2 pots of wine every single day. The female ghost in white attempted to approach them several times, but she would immediately be pushed back by their formless yang energy once she ventured too close to them. After failing several times, she could only huff in anger and travel elsewhere, making her way to the residences of the poorer families to drag her fingernails across their doors and courtyard walls. Some people were snoring loudly and fast asleep, so they were completely oblivious to the commotion caused by the female ghost. However, some people were easily woken, and they trembled in fear as they listened to the strange noises around their residence. This caused the female ghost to giggle in amusement, making the experience even more harrowing. Seeing that the female ghost didn't actually enter the residence rooms to harm anyone, Chen Ping'an pretended that he wasn't able to see anything. He lay down on the roof ridge and crossed his legs, after which he retrieved his folding fan and lightly rocked it back and forth. One of the most frightening things about a certain chain of events was having it extend and failing to see the start and the end of the chain clearly. This was especially the case if the start of the chain reached the heaven, the end of the chain reached the underworld, and if the chain pertained to past lives, future lives, and the fuzzy notions of status and order. What was even more frightening than this was a complicated web of branch events extending from the main chain, leading to countless smaller chains and a blurry line between good and bad. Everything would become chaotic and interrelated, and when a certain chain of events was extended, rendering it impossible to objectively focus on the facts, then it would become increasingly difficult to look into the future. For example, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong for a cultivator to kill the female ghost who was purposely disturbing the residents of the prefectural city, and it would be reasonable for them to accumulate merit and virtue in this manner. If one cast their gaze further, however, would the mortal humans in the prefectural city and surrounding areas of Ritual Baton Prefecture feel the need to re-evaluate the notion of karmic fate and ever-changing fortune when they had sinister thoughts and urges in the future, given they became aware of the existence of ghosts in the world? Moreover, the female ghost wasn't truly harming people when she wandered around at night, so how should her rights and wrongs actually be evaluated? And indeed, why had she hung herself and committed suicide in the past, with her attachment so strong that she became a ghost? What injustices had she suffered? Chun Ping'an closed his eyes and slept until morning. Cultivation could be performed at any time and at any place now, so it no longer mattered how Chun Ping'an traveled and how quickly he did so. When Chun Ping'an left the prefectural city in the morning, he saw a group of 4 people boldly tearing down a notice put up by the local government. By the looks of it, they were going to directly target the group of ghosts that had forcefully occupied a nearby temple. Chun Ping'an felt slightly puzzled. The 2 males and 2 females weren't dressed especially extravagantly, and they clearly weren't pretending to be poor either. Rather, they genuinely weren't wealthy. The eldest of the group was a middle-aged man at the 2nd tier of martial arts, and the young boy standing beside him was most likely his disciple. The young boy could just barely be regarded as a pure martial artist. As for the 2 females, they looked like young sisters who had just become chi refiners and embarked on the path of cultivation, with the spiritual energy in their acupoints extremely thin and almost negligible. Chun Ping'an had seen through the powerful cultivator from the blissful dream nation who had disguised himself as a storyteller, and this was due to the intangible aura that he had exuded. As such, Chun Ping'an had become alert even though the storyteller had disguised himself as a 2nd-tier chi refiner. On the other hand, the 2 martial artists and 2 chi refiners genuinely possessed lowly cultivation bases. Perhaps it wouldn't be difficult for them to deal with the female ghost hovering around the prefectural city, but the group of ghosts occupying the nearby temple was clearly great in number and power. After all, they had dared to blatantly occupy a temple with decent incense offerings and shoo away all of the monks. With this in mind, it would presumably be very difficult for the 4 cultivators to vanquish the ghosts. If they weren't careful, and if they didn't have any life-saving trump cards, then they might even be surrounded and killed in the temple. Chun Ping'an pondered for a moment and decided not to leave the prefectural city straight away. Instead, he listened to the quiet chatter of the 4 people, who thought that their conversation was a complete secret. They discussed their plans to grind down the gold ingot in their possession, transforming it into gold powder. A young girl whose cheeks were bright red from the morning chill suggested that it would be best for them to use official gold ingots from the government, and that they should also use the official notice from the prefectural office to borrow a few incense-infused tools from the city god temple, the scholarly temple, and the martial sage temple. By doing so, they would enjoy a greater chance of success and also improve the safety of their trip to the Golden Bell Monastery. The young boy grumbled in slight displeasure, questioning why they didn't vanquish those fox spirits and rabbit spirits instead. This represented 2 sets of reward money, one from the local government and one from the large clans, and it would definitely be an easier and safer task as well. The slender and slightly older girl with an ordinary appearance explained to the young boy that the ghosts and spirits in the Golden Bell Monastery would become much more alert if they dealt with the fox spirits and rabbit spirits first, making it much more difficult for them to successfully clear out the temple in the future. Judging from their solemn tones and serious discussions, the group of 4 cultivators wasn't feeling relaxed at all. This was in stark contrast to the middle-aged man's bold and gallant demeanor when tearing down the notice from the city wall. Chun Ping'an left the prefectural city and made his way to the Golden Bell Monastery, which was located 15 kilometers away. He stopped at a roadside resting pavilion 3 to 4 kilometers away from the Golden Bell Monastery, taking a rest and waiting for the 4 cultivators to arrive. A mountain stream bubbled away beside the pavilion. Chun Ping'an waited all the way until noon for the 4 cultivators to finally arrive. Chun Ping'an started to make his way to the Golden Bell Monastery without waiting for them to arrive at the pavilion. Carrying the bamboo case on his back and holding a hiking pole in his hand, he purposely slowed down his pace and appeared like a frail scholar who was struggling to make his way forward. The 4 cultivators quickly caught up to the scholar in white, and the middle-aged man holding a large tube of incense sticks glanced at him as he walked past. He quickly retracted his gaze, and the young boy who appeared naive and expressionless cracked a grin, causing the scholar in white to also smile. The young boy smiled even wider, and he didn't immediately wipe the smile from his face even after he turned around. The slightly older girl frowned but didn't say anything. Her younger sister wanted to say something, but the slightly older girl grabbed her sleeve and gestured for her not to invite unnecessary trouble. The younger girl with bright red cheeks didn't say anything, but after taking a few steps, she couldn't help but turn around and ask with a smile, "Scholar, are you heading to the Golden Bell Monastery to offer incense? Haven't you heard that no one in the entire Ritual Baton Prefecture visits the temple anymore? Yet you're still insisting on visiting? Are you rushing to offer the first stick of incense for the day?" The scholar wiped the sweat from his forehead, panting as he smiled and replied, "I only just arrived at Ritual Baton Prefecture, and I have a friend who's acquainted with the monks at the Golden Bell Monastery. He said that I could seek temporary accommodation and study there, not needing to spend any silver coins and also being able to enjoy a peaceful and quiet environment." The younger girl was just about to say something, yet her older sister pinched her arm and caused her to frown in pain. The younger girl turned her head and said in a low voice, "Big sister, it's daytime right now, so there won't be ghosts and spirits from the temple sneaking around to spy on us. If this scholar follows us to the Golden Bell Monastery, then should we save him afterward when we start to fight with those ghosts? Won't this make things even more difficult? If we don't save him, then my conscience will feel troubled even if we vanquish the ghosts and spirits at the temple. I need to tell him about the situation and warn him not to seek a futile death. Where can't a scholar read and study? Yet he insists on barging over to a temple occupied by ghosts and spirits. Seriously, what's wrong with him? With his terrible luck, I surmise that he doesn't have any chance of becoming a champion scholar." The slightly older girl sighed and forcefully flicked her younger sister's forehead with a finger, replying, "Say as little as possible. After blocking this scholar, you're not allowed to act on your whims during our trip to the Golden Bell Monastery anymore. You need to listen to me." The younger girl was overjoyed, and she slowed down until she was walking side by side with the scholar. Meanwhile, her older sister and the 2 martial artists walked further and further ahead. The younger girl's first remark was extremely interesting and she asked, "Scholar, are you married yet? What do you think about my older sister's appearance?" The traveling scholar from a foreign region smiled and replied, "Please don't joke around like this, Mississippi." The younger girl smiled in amusement and conceded, "I'm just messing around with you." She then put on a stern expression and continued, "However, what I'm going to say next isn't a joke. The Golden Bell Monastery is extremely dangerous right now, and a large group of vicious ghosts suddenly appeared one night and occupied the temple after shooing away all of the monks. Even the abbot who was knowledgeable in Buddhism was killed on the spot, and many monks and worshippers who were unable to flee in time were also killed by the vicious ghosts. The ghosts that are occupying the temple will genuinely eat people, so it's best that you avoid visiting the Golden Bell Monastery. In any case, there's not a single bald monk at the temple anymore. I'm not trying to scare you for fun, and if you don't believe me, you can verify what I said with the people in the prefectural city. If I'm lying to you, then you'll only be taking a slight detour and wasting a small amount of time. If I'm telling the truth, however, then won't you die a futile death in foreign lands? In that case, how will you become an outstanding scholar and bring glory to your clan? Then why are you and your 3 companions heading over to offer incense?" the scholar asked. The young girl stomped her foot and exclaimed, "Can't you tell that we're capable cultivators traveling over to vanquish the ghosts?" The scholar faltered for a moment before laughing loudly and remarking, "Since when did there exist ghosts and demons in the world? Please don't lie to me, Mississippi." The slightly older girl and the middle-aged man exchanged a glance and shook their heads. The young boy suppressed a smile. Only the young girl with adorable red cheeks became worried, saying in a frantic voice, My older sister said that scholars like you are the most difficult to convince once you become stubbornly set on something. If you continue to ignore the dangers, then my only option is to knock you out with a single punch and throw you back inside the resting pavilion. However, this is dangerous as well, especially if one or two ghosts wander over at night. You'll still end up dead if they manage to catch your scent. You've become a dumb goose from studying too much, so hurry up and leave. The scholar appeared slightly foolish as he replied, "But I'm extremely hungry right now, and I genuinely don't have enough money and food to travel to the prefectural city and back. I'll take a glance from outside the Golden Bell Monastery in a moment, and I'll immediately turn around and leave if what you say is true, and there truly aren't any worshippers or monks." The young girl sighed in grief and lamented. My older sister told me that those ghosts are able to channel mystical abilities and unleash waves of murderous aura and black clouds enough to blot out heaven and earth. How will you run away at that time? The young girl looked forward and shouted, "Big sis, let me bring this dumb goose back to the prefectural city first. If push comes to shove, I'll just run a bit quicker and make sure that I arrive at the Golden Bell Monastery before nighttime." The slightly older girl had a furious expression as she scolded, "We already picked the time beforehand, and this was because we were afraid of the ghosts in the temple being able to appear during daytime. By arriving earlier, we'll be able to place more talismans around the temple. If you're not present, then what will we do if the vicious ghosts are able to soar into the sky and surround the entire temple? Perhaps you want to collect our 3 corpses when you arrive afterward? Have you already forgotten about the troubles that we faced before?" The young girl felt dejected and in low spirits as she nodded in understanding. She then said to the scholar, "You should turn around and leave now. We're not familiar with each other in any case, so I naturally have no reason to trick you for fun and purposely lie about the existence of ghosts and spirits at the Golden Bell Monastery." However, the scholar stubbornly insisted on going to the entrance of the Golden Bell Monastery to take a look, and this made the young girl so upset and angry that tears started to brim in her eyes. The young girl was just about to reach forward and punch him. He was completely dismissing her goodwill, but she naturally couldn't watch him stroll headfirst to his own death, could she? However, the dumb goose scholar surprisingly took a step back and lectured, "Please don't get physical and hit me, Mississippi. A noble person should settle disputes through reason and not violence. If you knock me unconscious and toss me back to the resting pavilion, what will you do if someone steals my bamboo case afterward? Will you compensate me?" The young girl turned around and briskly walked over to her older sister, raising a hand and roughly wiping her eyes. She didn't understand how there could be such a heartless person in the world. She was almost upset to death. However, she couldn't help but turn around and glance back, only to see that the dumb goose scholar was truly following them to the temple. She hesitated for a moment, thinking about whether she should catch him by surprise and knock him unconscious. However, the dumb goose was dumb when he needed to be clever, and clever when he needed to be dumb, unexpectedly stopping in his tracks when he saw her glance back. The young girl was just about to scold him, yet her older sister had already grabbed her arm and chided, "Stop wasting time." The young girl lowered her head. Chun Ping'an smiled in his mind. By the looks of it, he had caused a good person to become disappointed. Chun Ping'an continued to slowly follow the group of 4 cultivators, falling further and further behind them as time went on. The young girl wanted to turn around again, but her older sister angrily scolded, "Will you only be happy once you ruin our plans and cause everyone to die? Are you not afraid that he's actually a ghost from that vicious group occupying the temple?" The young girl finally resisted the urge to turn around. She lowered her head and continued to walk forward, kicking the small stones on the road as she did so. Her older sister sighed in grief and lamented, "You'll eventually suffer greatly with a personality like that. Have we not witnessed a significant number of people doing good deeds, but suffering bad outcomes during our journey through the cultivation world?" The young girl replied with a nod and didn't retort her older sister. In the distance, a bored scholar in white used his hiking pole to move the small stones back to their original positions, smiling faintly as he mused, "Is that truly the case?" The young girl secretly turned her head and glanced back when the group of 4 cultivators arrived near the Golden Bell Monastery, yet the twists and turns in the mountain path meant that she could no longer see the figure of that stubborn scholar in white. After walking forward for another 500 meters, the area in front of the 4 cultivators suddenly opened up. "We're here." the slightly older girl said with a solemn expression. The middle-aged man nodded in acknowledgement. A faint murderous aura flowed through the Golden Bell Monastery. Yet this aura was extremely thin and could seemingly be dispersed by the wind. The slightly older girl had a puzzled expression as she commented, "Something doesn't seem right. I observed the temple from afar last night, and there should be much more murderous aura than this." The middle-aged man pondered for a moment before saying, "This is a good thing. Perhaps these filthy ghosts are forced to hide underground when it's daytime, so this will coincidentally give my disciple and me more time to put up the talismans, as well as spread the glutinous rice and dog blood. At the same time, you and your sister can set up the necessary formations. When evening arrives and there's still some lingering light, we can use sudden and overwhelming force to force the ghosts out of the ground. At that time we'll be in a very strong position to achieve victory, seeing that the ghosts will no longer have any sort of advantage." The slightly older girl nodded in agreement before turning to her eager little sister and saying, "Make sure to focus and don't become careless. Ghosts and entities have all kinds of strange and unpredictable abilities, so if the Golden Bell Monastery is truly a trap that's purposely luring us in, then we'll definitely suffer immensely if we aren't careful enough." "Don't worry, big sis," the young girl said with a glowing expression. When they arrived at the entrance of the Golden Bell Monastery, the young girl with red cheeks nimbly jumped onto the temple wall, allowing her to see the many skeletons scattered on the ground in front of the main hall. These were most likely skeletons of the monks and worshippers who hadn't been able to flee in time. The young girl rapidly launched an expensive yellow paper talisman drawn with gold powder, and had it stick onto the door lintel of the main hall. The talisman surprisingly didn't show any signs of combustion, and after a short moment the young girl turned around and said, "There are temporarily no ghosts in the main hall, so Uncle Song can rest assured and place talismans on the temple doors. After entering the temple, Uncle Song can feel free to scatter glutinous rice along the walls." Afterward, the two sisters leaped up and entered the temple first, sticking ordinary yellow paper talismans onto the walls and corridor pillars. Meanwhile, the precious gold powder talismans were reserved for important locations such as the doors of the Great Hall and the plaques above the doors. The middle-aged man and his disciple casually tossed away the tubes of incense outside the temple, after which they put down their bags and retrieved several cotton pouches that were heavy and filled with aged glutinous rice, as well as several leather water bladders filled with dog blood. They then started to deftly set up some so-called formations. The four cultivators carried out their respective tasks in the large temple and eventually converged at the end, with all of them remaining safe and sound. There was only a single side hall with a tightly shut door that the young girl said was brimming with a strong murderous aura, so the four of them worked together to stick dozens of yellow paper talismans on the doors, windows, roof ridge and curved eaves. The young girl personally placed talismans on the rooftop, after which she started to lift up the roof tiles and allow sunshine to penetrate into the side hall. This caused anguished wails to erupt in the hall, and there was also the crackling sound of black mist being scorched by the sun and transformed into ashes. In the end, the four cultivators gathered before the entrance of the side hall. They exchanged a smile with each other. The slightly older girl held a demon-binding chain which she had once spent her life savings of 40 whopping snowflake coins to purchase. Her younger sister acted even stranger, chanting a mantra before squatting down and retrieving an embroidered pouch. After untying the pouch rope, a collection of ancient and strange copper coins started to automatically roll into the surroundings by themselves. As for the middle-aged man and his disciple, they remained empty-handed as they prepared to fight with their fists. However, the middle-aged man had a ring of throwing knives hanging around his waist, with each throwing knife engraved with talismanic symbols. It was clear that these weren't ordinary weapons carried by martial artists from the cultivation world. The slightly older girl and the middle-aged man exchanged a smile. By the looks of it, the cultivation bases of the ghosts and spirits in the temple weren't as high as they had initially anticipated. Moreover, these beings were extremely afraid of sunlight, so if things were as they expected, there definitely weren't dozens of vicious ghosts gathered in the temple as the rumors said. Rather, the residents of Ritual Baton Prefecture were far too terrified of the situation, causing them to incorrectly spread the rumor, and making it become increasingly inaccurate. It was thanks to this that the four of them now had an opportunity to earn a big reward. They were truly enjoying great fortune. It could be said that they were enjoying fortune beyond their wildest dreams. When discussing the matters at the prefectural overseer's office before, they had haggled with the stingy old official for a long time, tricking and frightening him before he finally promised to pay them 5,000 taels of silver if they succeeded. However, this was a very small amount, and it definitely wouldn't be enough for them to go to such great lengths to suppress the ghosts at the Golden Bell Monastery. It would become an even worse deal if they suffered any injuries or casualties during battle. However, there were greater rewards in addition to those promised by the prefectural overseer's office, with the prefectural overseer promising 30,000 taels of silver, a sum that the wealthy worshippers in the prefectural city were willing to raise together. That being the case, it became very worthwhile to take the risk and suppress the ghosts at the Golden Bell Monastery. And now they were unexpectedly able to claim huge rewards with little effort. The middle-aged man was delighted as he looked around with a confident and content expression, thinking that they could return to the prefectural city to claim their reward of 35,000 taels of silver, once they disposed of the ghosts in the side hall. At that time they would split the rewards 30-70 as agreed on before, leaving more than 10,000 taels of silver for him and his disciple. Sure enough, today was an auspicious day to vanquish demons and eliminate ghosts. They started to take action, with the copper coins retrieved by the younger girl rolling around the side hall once before standing upright on the ground. The younger girl put her index finger and forefinger together, silently reciting a mantra and causing the copper coins to instantly burrow into the ground. Her face became slightly pale, and she looked toward her sister after completing this task. The slightly older girl nodded and said to the middle-aged man in a quiet voice, "My younger sister and I will go onto the rooftop in a moment to gauge the strength of the ghosts first. If they're forced to run outside, then the two of you should immediately attack them and prevent them from fleeing outside the temple. If they continue to hide and refuse to leave the side hall, then we should directly dismantle the side hall while there's still some sunlight remaining. The copper coins released by my younger sister can create a cage around the area, but it won't be able to imprison the ghosts for too long. As such, the two of you need to act as quickly as possible if the ghosts run outside in a moment." The middle-aged man nodded in response and said, "Rest assured." The two sisters jumped onto the rooftop of the side hall again, launching yellow paper talismans inside, and occasionally launching a few precious gold powder talismans. The young boy also retrieved a copper mirror, slanting it sideways and having it point toward the windows of the side hall. A young scholar in white was actually sitting on a nearby rooftop with a bamboo case on his back. However, there was a steel-carrying talisman from the Ghost Axe Palace stuck on his body, resulting in the four cultivators not being able to see him due to their relatively low cultivation bases. An intense and soul-stirring battle took place. Black smoke soared into the sky, and even though countless talismans rushed into the side hall, with the slightly older girl using her demon-binding chain to whip the black smoke again and again, the young boy using his copper mirror to scorch the black smoke, and the middle-aged man using his throwing knives to pierce the black smoke, the black smoke was still wanton and unrestrained after it fled from the cage surrounding the side hall. In order to save the young boy, the slightly older girl was even struck in the back by a burst of black smoke, causing her to cough up blood and collapse to the ground. However, she still fought to stand up, continuing to form hand seals and launch the yellow paper talismans that she had drawn. In the end, these talismans transformed into a talismanic fire dragon, and the slightly older girl went as far as to exhaust her spiritual energy to protect the four of them. The scholar in white furrowed his brows and slapped his forehead, saying in an exasperated voice, "You actually dared to come to the Golden Bell Monastery to vanquish the ghosts with such measly abilities? And this is after I already helped you kill 80 to 90% of the vicious ghosts." He smiled faintly and lightly snapped his fingers. The black smoke that had escaped from some sort of restriction just then instantly condensed together and landed on the ground, transforming into a vicious ghost that measured 3 meters in height. Afterward, the four cultivators finally managed to kill the vicious ghost in a perilous battle. The young girl was hunched over as she wiped away the blood from the corners of her mouth and her nose, and she asked with a dazzling smile, "Big sis, I didn't hold everyone back this time, did I?" The slightly older girl felt relieved to be alive, and the rims of her eyes were red as she briskly walked over to support her swaying little sister. She shot a glare and scolded, "Why are you trying to play a hero? Stop talking and tend to your wounds." The young boy looked at the extremely damaged ancient copper mirror in his hand before glancing at his heavily panting master. The latter faltered for a moment, and after seeing the vicious look in the young boy's eyes, he hesitated a little before lightly nodding in response. The middle-aged man then looked around and laughed loudly, saying, "Miss Xining, little Quan, heaven and earth are bright and clear now, so it's clear that all of the ghosts and spirits have been vanquished. Why don't we rest at the temple tonight before returning to the prefectural city tomorrow?" Xining, the slightly older girl, furrowed her brows and replied, "The Golden Bell Monastery is indeed free of murderous aura now, but the vicious ghosts have already occupied this area for a very long time? What if we let slip one or two of them? My sister and I have already used up all of our talismans, and we no longer have the ability to fight against enemies. It's best that we return to the prefectural city as soon as possible." The young boy shook his head and said, "Big Sister Xining, the prefectural overseer will definitely get the wrong idea and think that it was far too easy for us to deal with the vicious ghosts if we return too early. If he's truly shameless enough, then we can most likely still collect the 5,000 taels of silver since the contract is written on paper. However, it's difficult to say whether or not the prefectural overseer will shamelessly pocket the 30,000 taels of silver himself. Not only should we not leave tonight, but we should even dismantle a few more walls of the temple before returning to collect our full reward. Moreover, we need to purposely tell the prefectural overseer that one or two of the vicious ghosts managed to escape. As such, he needs to offer us an additional 5,000 taels of silver to hunt down the remaining ghosts and finish off the job." The young girl rolled her eyes upon hearing this. However, she hurriedly turned around and covered her mouth as she coughed up another mouthful of blood. This was slightly embarrassing. The slightly older girl pondered for a moment before nodding and replying with a smile, "Then we'll follow this plan and return to the prefectural city tomorrow. We can stay in the temple for the night, and this will also give my younger sister some time to rest and recuperate." A flustered scholar in white suddenly ran over from a corridor beside the main hall at this moment, exclaiming in panic, "Why are there so many skeletons in front of the main hall? Why isn't there a single monk in the temple? Perhaps there are truly demons causing trouble here?" The young girl was incredibly annoyed at him right now, but she also felt slightly at ease upon seeing that he was still alive and kicking. Afterward, the middle-aged man and his disciple retrieved the remaining talismans and placed the leftover glutinous rice back inside their pouches, keeping them for future use. The slightly older girl picked a quiet room in the temple that was usually reserved for wealthy visitors to stay and copy scriptures. Her younger sister sat cross-legged in the corridor outside and started to meditate and perform breathing techniques. Meanwhile, her older sister continued to observe the surroundings, lest anything unexpected happen. The cowardly scholar insisted on following the two sisters, and he sat down on the steps and acted like a door god after putting down his bamboo case. It was still evening, and the slightly older girl returned to the room carrying a large bag of some seemingly valuable books and scriptures that she had collected from around the temple. The young girl opened her eyes and smiled, saying to the scholar who was sitting with his back facing her, "It's almost nighttime, so it won't be long before vicious ghosts start to appear here and cause commotion. Are you not going to run away?" The scholar in white turned around and replied with a faint smile, "The books say that humans are afraid of ghosts, but ghosts are even more afraid of the human heart. However, I feel like young Miss is a good person, so staying close to you will be better." The young girl racked her brains for a response and she waved a fist and said, "Are you praising me or criticizing me? Be careful of my fist if you continue to act so bastardly." The scholar raised his hands in surrender and said, "A noble person should settle disputes through reason and not violence." The young girl chuckled, feeling amused and playful as she replied, "I'm not a noble person, and I'm also a girl as well. Come, let me reward you with a punch to make you a bit smarter. Perhaps you can even become a champion scholar after I knock some sense into you." The scholar in white had genuinely gone stupid from reading too much, and he surprisingly smiled and said, "Young Miss appears like an upright and kind person who's no inferior to a noble person." There was a look of displeasure on the slightly older girl's face as she interjected, "Since young master is a scholar who views himself as a noble person, then young master should be aware of the etiquette between men and women. That being the case, why is young master shamelessly remaining outside our residence? Is this appropriate?" However, just when the young girl felt like the scholar had become slightly smarter, she heard him say, I'm not a noble person, and I'm only an impoverished scholar. If there are truly ghosts in the Golden Bell Monastery, then I obviously can't run outside to seek death, so my best option is naturally to stay here. Piss off, the slightly older girl said with a stern expression. The young girl was just about to say something, but she immediately shut up in fright after seeing her older sister's angry glare. The scholar had no option but to grab his bamboo case and tremble with fear as he walked out of the courtyard. He was most likely walking over to the temple wall to repent? Why are you being so fierce, big sis? He's just a dumb goose scholar, the young girl said quietly. The slightly older girl frowned and replied, You need to rest and recuperate now, so there's no room for any mistake or error. It was already strange for this person to appear on the road to the temple before, and it was even stranger for him to enter the Golden Bell Monastery after us. If it weren't for him appearing on the road in front of us, then I would have physically shooed him away, to say nothing of verbally shooing him away. Her voice became soft and gentle as she continued, All right, you should continue to rest now. The young girl nodded in response, but she continued to glance at the courtyard door out of the corners of her eyes. Her older sister chuckled in anger and said, There are no ghosts and spirits remaining here, and there are only 5 living and breathing people. He'll simply feel afraid and apprehensive as he sleeps outside. However, are you not worried about your own sister? Are you not worried about the 2 people who fought alongside us? Why are you choosing to worry about an outsider instead? What's this? Perhaps you feel attracted to him because he's a scholar? Let me tell you this. Scholars are the most unreliable people in the world. Okay, I'll listen to you and cultivate here in earnest, the young girl responded in a pleading voice. It was already late at night. The young girl sat in the corridor and quietly cultivated in earnest. Meanwhile, her older sister sat on the steps and rested for a short moment, not daring to fall asleep. They were still inside the Golden Bell Monastery after all. Several throwing knives suddenly sliced through the air and surged over from outside the courtyard door. A familiar figure continued to stride over. Even though the slightly older girl was stunned and frightened, she still swung her large sleeves and knocked away the incisive throwing knives. A throwing knife directly flew toward her younger sister's neck with force and vigor, with this weapon being unleashed by the young boy squatting on a temple wall. The slightly older girl allowed a throwing knife to pierce into her shoulder, as she lunged over to grab the throwing knife that was only 2 inches from ripping through her younger sister's neck. However, the middle-aged martial artist had already arrived beside her with a single step, striking her temple with a punch and sending her flying through the wall and the window, eventually crashing into the wing room. The slightly older girl continued to cough up blood, struggling to stand up but failing to do so. The young boy nimbly jumped down the temple wall and said with a sinister smile, Master, can we not kill little Quan for the moment? It's best that we keep big sister Xining alive as well. We simply need to cripple their immortal abilities. The middle-aged man raised a hand and launched a palm strike at the young girl whose cultivation they had forcefully interrupted, shaking his head and saying, This little girl is more difficult to deal with, so Master will help you keep her older sister alive instead. The young boy roared with laughter and exclaimed, Ha ha ha, we've obtained both money and beautiful women. The middle-aged man suddenly turned his head, wrapping his hand around the slightly older girl's neck as he looked toward the courtyard door. The young boy rapidly made his way over to the middle-aged man's side. Over at the courtyard door, someone stuck their head inside and said in a timid voice, It's not very good to do these things inside a peaceful and tranquil Buddhist temple, is it? The young girl's expression was livid, and she moved her lips as if wanting to warn the dumb goose scholar to hurry up and run away. The scholar in white seemingly caught sight of the young girl's expression as well, and he faltered for a moment before asking, Kind young girl, perhaps you want me to save you? Rest assured, I'm a chivalrous and upright person, and after reading so many sagely books, I dare say that I'm actually filled with a righteous aura that gives rise to blissful winds. The young girl tried her best to shake her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. Her cheeks were bright red. She appeared as adorable as could be. The scholar's eyes slowly narrowed, and he no longer appeared like a naive and foolish person. He boldly stepped to the entrance of the courtyard and raised a hand, snapping his fingers and commanding, You can come out now. Some people in the Yang world deserve to be devoured by vicious ghosts from the Yin world. The middle-aged man and the young boy saw a vicious ghost that measured 3 meters in height timidly walk out from behind the weakling scholar's back, with its raging aura far stronger than that of the ghost they had defeated before. The middle-aged man immediately let go of the slightly older girl's neck and remarked, "Young master is actually the Ghost King here, right? It was all a misunderstanding, and my disciple and I definitely have no intentions of sullying this precious area. It was all the fault of these 2 cultivators, what with them wanting to take all of the merit and reward money for themselves." The malicious ghost transformed into a cloud of rolling black smoke and instantly enveloped the middle-aged man, shortly after which the sound of tearing flesh and snapping bones could be heard amid the heart-wrenching screaming. The young boy surprisingly didn't freeze to the spot in terror, and he still had the strength to tap his foot and leap onto the wall, rapidly fleeing into the distance. As if receiving a new command, the malicious ghost let go of the middle-aged man who was already dead and flew out of the courtyard to hunt the young boy. It wasn't long before similarly pitiful shrieks and tearing sounds traveled over from the distance. Afterward, a ray of sword light descended from the sky and elicited a deafening and anguished wail from the malicious ghost, one that even the residents of the prefectural city could presumably hear. This was a wail that would definitely frighten countless mortal residents. However, peace and quiet quickly returned to the world. The young girl was dumbstruck, and she asked with a dazed expression, "You're the Ghost King?" The scholar smiled and sat down on the steps, asking in response, "What do you think? Don't eat me first, okay? Let me check on my big sis," the young girl suddenly replied. "All right," the scholar replied with a nod. The young girl wanted to glare at him, but upon realizing that he was most likely the Ghost King at the Golden Bell Monastery, she hurriedly ran over to check on her older sister and help her out of the wing room. The slightly older girl smiled bitterly and remained silent, standing there defenselessly as she waited for death to arrive. She had clearly witnessed the commotion outside just then. There was a complicated and despondent expression on the young girl's face as she looked at the pile of mangled flesh and bones on the ground. How had this happened? She and her older sister hadn't died at the hands of the ghosts, yet they had almost died at the hands of the middle-aged man and his disciple, both of whom they had traveled with for a long time across more than half of the Locust Flower Nation. They had appeared like fairly good people. When she and her older sister walked out of the wing room, the scholar in white had already stood up and walked toward the courtyard. He simply turned his head to look at the young girl, saying, "After today's events, your older sister will definitely tell you in a definitive manner that there are always so many bad people in the world. However, you don't need to feel disappointed. The world and its people aren't correct just because they're always like this. No matter how many injustices you witness and come across, again and again, I hope you always remember that you're still correct." The scholar in white retrieved a bamboo hat and put it on, continuing, "See, good people enjoying good fortunes and bad people suffering miserable fortunes is true, at least for tonight." After walking out of the courtyard, he suddenly leaned back and said with a dazzling smile, "You're very beautiful, young miss, so you'll definitely be able to find a good man in the future." The young girl didn't know whether to laugh or to cry, and she wiped the tears from her cheeks as she chided softly, "How annoying!" However, she suddenly recalled the ray of golden light from just then. So she asked with a bright glimmer in her eyes, "You're actually a sword immortal, aren't you?" The scholar in white slowly straightened his back and replied with a faint smile, "I'm a sword cultivator who's become a dumb goose from studying too much." Afterward, he transformed into a ray of brilliant white light that launched up from the ground and flew toward the north.